I'll verify the Ridulph case status and key facts first, so the narration doesn't accidentally treat a disputed conviction as settled. After that, I'll begin the script in the requested voice. The Ridulph case waits on the desk in front of you tonight. A quiet file with old paper, winter light, and evidence that once seemed to solve everything. There is no hurry here, and the pages can turn slowly. You begin in Sycamore, Illinois, on the 3rd of December, 1957, when the air had that hard Midwestern cold that settles into wool sleeves and window glass. The streets were ordinary streets, with porch lamps, shoveled walks, damp mittens, and the faint smell of snow packed under passing tires. In the Ridulph case, the first details are small enough to fit inside a child's evening, and yet they would be carried for decades by detectives, parents, neighbors, and strangers who never stopped wondering. You can imagine yourself at the table now, the lamp low, the folder open, your hand resting near a photocopy softened by time. There is Maria Ridulph, 7 years old, living in a town where people knew one another's cars and front steps. There is her friend Kathy, out with her in the early evening, playing near the corner of Center Cross Street and Archie Place. The names of those streets have a plain sound, almost gentle, as though they belong to errands, school mornings, and the slow closing of curtains after supper. The file does not begin with certainty. It begins with memory. You read that the girls were outside in the cold, and you can almost hear the scrape of shoes on frozen pavement, the small breath of winter in the throat, the soft crackle of coats when children move their arms. A young man approached them, according to Kathy's later account, and gave the name Johnny. He was ordinary enough in that moment to become part of a conversation, a face near the edge of play, a person remembered through the long distance of childhood. When you sit with a file like this, you learn how much can rest on what a child saw under a winter sky. Kathy would remember pieces, as children do, not in neat legal lines, but in impressions. A name, a face, a manner, a moment when she went home briefly for mittens, leaving Maria behind. You can feel how quiet that page becomes, because everyone who later read it understood that the simplest errand, the briefest turning away, had become a hinge in the life of a town. The first search had no modern language around it, no database glow, no fast alerts across phones. There were calls, footsteps, car headlights, doors opening in the cold, and neighbors checking porches and yards. You can picture men and women moving through Sycamore with flashlights, breath showing white, their gloves stiff around metal handles. The Ridulph family waited in rooms that must have felt suddenly too bright and too small, every sound at the door carrying more hope than a person can comfortably hold. At first, the police were working with what people could say. They had Kathy's memory of Johnny. They had the place where Maria had last been seen. They had the shape of a neighborhood evening, now taken apart piece by piece. You turn the page and notice how patient the earliest work had to be, because every answer depended on someone remembering accurately, someone speaking clearly, someone calling back after a thought arrived later, perhaps while washing dishes or folding a coat. One of the strange things about old investigations is how evidence can sit quietly before anyone understands its weight. A receipt, a phone record, a photograph, a train ticket, a witness statement typed with a ribbon that leaves uneven ink on the page. These things do not announce themselves. They simply wait. In the Ridulph case, the evidence that seemed to solve the case many years later would come from the odd corners of the record, where ordinary paper had survived longer than ordinary memory. But before those papers were lifted again, there was only the first winter and the long waiting that began after Maria Ridulph disappeared. You move into the next part of the file as the calendar turns from December into the colder months, and the Ridulph case becomes not just a search, but a vigil. The town kept looking. Officers followed reports. The family listened for news that did not come in the way they needed it to come. In old photographs of Midwestern towns from that era, the streets often look wider than they are, lined with bare trees and low houses, and you can almost feel the dry heat from radiators behind closed curtains. There were many eyes on the case, including local police, state investigators, and federal agents. That, too, tells you something about the fear and care surrounding it. A missing child in 1957 could gather a whole network of attention, but the tools were still human tools. People wrote names in notebooks. They compared descriptions. They knocked on doors until their hands were cold. You can hear the quiet clack of a typewriter in some office, making a witness's uncertain memory look more solid than it may have felt. The name Johnny mattered. It was small, common, and difficult. The sort of name that could point everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Kathy had said that was what he called himself. Investigators asked who in or near the neighborhood might fit. They looked at young men, former neighbors, passing strangers, and names that came through tips. You sit with that problem now, and you can feel the dull ache of it, because a common name can become a maze when everyone wants it to be a door. Among the people who entered the file was a young man then known as John Tessier, who had lived near the Ridulph family. Years later, he would be known as Jack McCullough. That change of name would make the file feel layered, as old cases often do, with one person appearing under different labels at different times. You notice it as you read, because names in a cold case are not only identifiers, they are bookmarks left by time, showing where a life changed while the file stayed still. At the time, Tessier was questioned. He gave an account of where he had been. There was talk of travel, military matters, and a trip connected to Rockford. In the dry language of investigation, an alibi can sound simple, but you know, sitting at the desk with the paper under your fingers, that an alibi is really made of clocks, distances, weather, roads, receipts, calls, and the willingness of strangers to remember what happened on an ordinary evening. The early case did not close around him, it moved outward. Investigators chased many leads, and in the months that followed, the search widened beyond Sycamore. Reports came in from places where people thought they had seen Maria. Some were sincere, some were mistaken. All of them required time. You can imagine the accumulation of paper, each sheet slightly different in weight and color, each one carrying a person's attempt to help, and each one asking detectives to spend a little more of themselves. Then, in April of 1958, Maria's remains were found near Woodbine, Illinois, far from the corner where the winter evening had begun. We do not need to linger on the physical details. For our purposes tonight, it is enough to sit with the fact that the search changed shape. The hope of finding Maria alive ended, and the patient work of understanding what had happened took its place, quieter, heavier, and more permanent. The file must have felt different after that. You can almost smell the damp earth on reports brought in from the field, the cold metal of filing cabinets, the stale coffee in offices where people stayed late. Detectives still had the name Johnny. They still had Kathy's memory. They still had an unknown path between Sycamore and Woodbine. And they had the hard fact that a child's life had been taken from the people who loved her, leaving questions that would outlive many of the first investigators. In the years that followed, the Ridulph case did what many cold cases do. It did not vanish. It settled. It became a file that could be pulled down, reviewed, retyped, discussed, and returned to storage. You can picture the folder changing hands over decades, its edges softening, its staples dulling, its pages copied until the older ink looked pale and tired. Every so often someone would look again, because unsolved cases have a way of asking quietly from the shelf. Years later, when the file came down again, the evidence that seemed strange and almost too ordinary would begin to matter in a new way. You turn the page slowly now, and the Ridulph case moves from the first investigation into the long middle years, when patience became the main tool. This is the part of a cold case that rarely sounds dramatic, but it is often where the deepest human work happens. A detective retires and still remembers. A family member keeps clippings. A witness grows older and carries the same winter scene inside her. The town changes its storefronts and streetlights, while the old question remains under everything. For decades, the case was spoken of as one of the oldest unsolved child murder cases in the United States. That kind of phrase can sound large and public, but when you sit with the pages, it becomes intimate again. It means birthdays without Maria. It means parents aging with no full answer. It means Kathy, the friend who survived the evening, remembering a face from childhood while her own face changed in mirrors year after year. Cold case work depends on return. You return to the same statements and ask whether a sentence was overlooked. You return to a timeline and ask whether a drive could have happened in the weather reported that night. You return to names that were crossed off too quickly or kept too long, and you try to be fair to everyone on the page. The paper smells faintly dusty now, and the room around you feels still, as if even the archive is listening. There were other possible suspects over time. Some names arrived because of patterns investigators thought they saw. Some came from other cases, other states, other troubled histories. The Ridulph case touched many lives in that way, not because every lead was strong, but because the absence of an answer creates space for possibility. You can feel how careful we must be here. Suspicion is not proof. A name in a file is not the same as truth. This is where patient detective work becomes a kind of restraint. You do not rush toward the neatest story. You let the rough edges remain rough. You ask what was known then, what was guessed later, and what was never more than a hope dressed as certainty. The old papers make small sounds as you shift them, a dry whisper at the corners, and that sound is part of the work. It reminds you that evidence is physical before it becomes argument. In 1994, Maria's mother, Frances Ridulph, died. Before her death, she had carried the case for more than 3 decades, and her family continued to carry it after her. Around the same broad period, attention turned again to Jack McCullough, the former John Tessier. The path back to him involved family memories, old suspicions, and statements that took on new importance when the case was reopened with fresh eyes and old wounds. One story that would later be discussed involved McCullough's mother, Eileen Tessier, and what family members described as words spoken near the end of her life. Deathbed statements can feel powerful in the imagination, but in a courtroom and in a careful review, they are fragile things. You can almost hear the quiet of a sick room around such a memory, the low hum of medical equipment, the soft scrape of a chair, the difficulty of knowing exactly what was meant and what was heard. Those statements helped draw attention back toward McCullough, but they were not the only pieces. There were yearbook images, old photographs, childhood recollections, and the long shadow of the name Johnny. The unusual evidence in the Ridulph case was not a single glittering clue. It was stranger than that. It was a collection of ordinary materials, each worn by age, that seemed to lean in one direction when arranged under a modern investigative light. You can see why people wanted the old case to give up its answer. There is mercy in a solved case, or at least people hope there is. A solved case promises that the waiting can be named, filed, and set down. But the Ridulph case teaches something more difficult. Sometimes evidence seems to close a circle, and then, years later, another piece of paper opens it again. Before that reversal came, though, investigators believed they were finally seeing a shape in the old winter file. The reopened Ridulph case asks you to hold 2 kinds of patience at once: the patience of those who searched for Maria, and the patience required to test whether a late answer is truly an answer. By the early 21st century, investigators had tools and habits that earlier officers did not have. They could organize old records differently. They could revisit witness identification practices. They could bring a cold case into a courtroom with the weight of history behind it. Kathy, Maria's childhood friend, became central again. She had been the child who saw the man called Johnny, the child who went home for mittens, the child whose memory had survived longer than many documents. Decades later, She identified Jack McCullough as the man she remembered. You can imagine the emotional weight of that moment without turning it into spectacle. A grown woman, looking back across more than 50 years, is not simply choosing a face. She is touching one of the most painful rooms in her memory. Eyewitness identification can feel deeply human and deeply uncertain at the same time. We trust faces because we live by them. We read kindness, worry, recognition, and distance in them every day. Yet memory changes with time, and the mind can preserve one detail while softening another. You sit with the page and feel the tension of that truth, because the Ridulph case depended so much on the face of a man seen briefly in childhood winter light. There were photographs used in the renewed investigation, including old images of McCullough from around the relevant time. Photographs have their own quiet strangeness in a cold case. The paper may curl slightly. The contrast may be harsh. A young face looks out from another era, unaware that it will someday be studied by detectives, lawyers, relatives, and strangers. You can almost feel the smooth surface of the photograph under a careful thumb, cool at first, then warm from being held too long. The evidence that seemed weird was not weird because it was loud. It was weird because it was ordinary and displaced from its original purpose. A train ticket was meant to mark travel. A phone record was meant to account for a call. A military document was meant to show attendance or processing. A family photograph was meant to preserve a face. In the Ridulph case, these common things became instruments for measuring where a person could and could not have been. At McCullough's trial in 2012, the prosecution presented the case as a long-delayed solution. The old identification, the family statements, and the reopened investigation all gathered in one place. There was no jury. The judge heard the evidence. You can picture a courtroom that is not dramatic, but formal, with polished wood, paper exhibits, a flag standing still, and people listening to names from 1957 as though the old winter had entered the room. McCullough was convicted. For a time, the Ridulph case was described as solved, and the phrase traveled widely because the age of the case made the conviction seem remarkable. An old mystery had reached a legal answer. A file that had waited for more than half a century appeared to have found its final label. You can understand why people exhaled. You can understand why others did not. Cold cases carry not only evidence, but longing, and longing can make closure feel necessary. But a conviction is not the same as the end of inquiry, and in this case the file was not finished speaking. McCullough maintained that he had not committed the crime. His defenders pointed to an alibi involving Rockford, military processing, travel, and a telephone call. These details had been in or near the case record for a very long time, but their meaning would change when someone slowed down enough to place them carefully against the clock. That is the quiet hinge of the Ridulph case tonight. Not a dramatic confession, not a hidden object found under floorboards. Just paper, time, distance, and the stubborn patience of rechecking. When the next box came down from the shelf, the Ridulph case began to turn around the very evidence that had once seemed too plain to carry such force. You can sit with that box for a moment. Maybe it is cardboard, with softened corners, and a lid that sighs slightly when lifted. Maybe the folders inside smell of dust, toner, old ink, and the faint mineral dryness of paper kept too long in government rooms. The key question became timing. Where was Jack McCullough, then John Tessier, during the window when Maria disappeared from Sycamore? In a cold case, time is not abstract. It is road miles. It is winter driving. It is a clock above a counter. It is a payphone receiver, cold against the ear. You can feel how the investigation narrows when the timeline is handled gently, without forcing it, as though each minute were a small bead being placed on a string. One of the most important pieces was a collect phone call. Records indicated that Tessier had called his mother from Rockford that evening. The call mattered because Rockford was not Sycamore. It was roughly 40 miles away, and the roads were icy that night. You read that detail and pause, because it has the plainness of truth, even before anyone argues over it. A phone call is not emotional. It does not remember. It simply records that a connection happened. There were also records connected to his military enlistment process. The account placed him in Rockford for an examination earlier that evening, and the related paperwork became part of the question. These documents were not romantic clues. They were bureaucratic scraps, made for other purposes, probably handled without ceremony by clerks who had no idea that the pages might be studied decades later. You can imagine the stamp pad, the ink, the dry pressure of a form being signed. The review, led by DeKalb County State's Attorney Richard Schmack, years after the conviction, treated these records with a different kind of attention. He looked again at the distance, the weather, the likely time of the disappearance, and the call from Rockford. The conclusion he reached was striking in its quiet way. McCullough could not have been in Sycamore at the crucial time if the Rockford evidence was understood correctly. This is where the title of the story becomes complicated. Weird evidence did seem to solve the Ridulph case once, because old memories, old images, and family statements helped build the case that convicted McCullough. Then another set of weird evidence, just as ordinary and just as patient, undid that solution. A phone record, a travel timeline, and military paperwork did not shout. They waited until someone read them closely enough. You can almost hear the low buzz of fluorescent lights over the review table, the soft drag of a chair on a government floor, the click of a pen opened and closed while someone checks the same time notation again. Patient investigation often looks like that. It is not always a chase. Sometimes it is a person alone with papers, asking whether everyone before him moved too fast at one important place. The court eventually vacated McCullough's conviction in 2016. The charges were dismissed. In 2017, he was declared innocent by the court. These are plain legal facts, and they matter deeply. The Ridulph case, once announced as solved, returned officially to the realm of the unsolved. That can feel unsettling, but it is also part of honest casework. The file must be allowed to correct itself, even when the correction is painful. You sit with that reversal, and the room seems quieter than before, because now the case contains two sorrows. There is the original loss of Maria Ridulph, held by her family and community across decades. There is also the recognition that a man was convicted in a case where later review found the evidence could not support that conviction. A careful narrator has to make room for both truths, because compassion is not a limited supply. And still, in the middle of all this, the strangest evidence remains. The paper that waited, the train and travel questions, the phone company record, the military timing, the photographs, the memory of a name spoken by a child. Each piece was ordinary. Each piece became heavy only when placed beside the others. From here, the file asks us to look more closely at memory, because memory was both the bridge back to the case and one of its deepest uncertainties. You begin with Kathy's memory, because in the Ridulph case, the winter evening survived most clearly through the friend who came back from the house and found the corner changed. You can sit with that fact for a while, because it is simple and painful without needing to be sharpened. Childhood memory is not a ledger, and it is not nothing either. It can hold a smell of cold air, a color of coat, a voice using a name, and it can lose the order of small things around it. You turn the page slowly, and you let that uncertainty stay visible. For the detectives who first listened to Kathy, her account was one of the few warm pieces of the night, still close to the time it happened. You can imagine an officer leaning toward her gently, trying not to frighten her, with a pencil paused above a notebook and a room made too quiet by adult worry. She was asked what the young man looked like, what he said, and how he behaved. The answers became part of the file, pressed into official language, but underneath the typing, there was still a child doing her best. Years later, when Kathy was asked again to look back, the act of remembering had changed. She was no longer the little girl on the corner. She had lived a whole life since Sycamore in 1957, and the face she carried had lived inside stories, questions, and the repeated telling of the same evening. You can feel how memory gathers dust, like everything else in a cold case. It may still be real, still sincere, still deeply felt, and yet it may not be the same untouched thing it once was. That does not make Kathy careless. It makes her human. You and I have both known the strange way old images return, sometimes clear as frost on a window, sometimes blurred at the edges. In the Ridulph case, her identification of McCullough decades later became one of the central supports for the prosecution's story. It was an act loaded with hope, grief, and pressure, though the courtroom treated it as testimony, with questions, answers, and a record made by a stenographer's steady hands. You can almost hear that courtroom sound, the soft keys, the rustle of legal pads, the low voice of a judge asking counsel to proceed. A photograph may have been passed, or a name spoken, or a memory asked to stand still under bright lights. The room would have smelled of polished wood, paper, wool coats, and maybe the faint dryness of heating vents.
In such a room, a childhood winter is brought indoors, and everyone tries to decide what it means. But memory was never the only evidence in the Ridulph case, and that is why we keep moving carefully through the file. The old investigation had made records of Tessier's alibi, and the later review found those records more important than they first appeared. You can picture the difference between a memory and a phone record. One comes from a living mind, with all its tenderness and strain. The other comes from a system, dull and limited, but sometimes useful, because it does not wish for anything. A phone record does not know Maria's name. It does not know the grief in Sycamore. It does not know whether a town has waited 50 years. It only tells you that a call happened, from one place to another, at a certain time, as noted by the system that handled it. In a case like this, that dry indifference can become precious. You lean closer to the page, not because it is dramatic, but because it is plain. The collect call from Rockford mattered because it placed Tessier away from Sycamore during a critical part of the evening. You do not have to force the detail to feel its weight. Rockford was not next door. Roads in December do not always behave kindly. A young man could travel, of course, but travel takes minutes, and minutes become stubborn when they are placed against a disappearance window. The Ridulph case, at this stage, becomes a study of whether ordinary time could stretch far enough. Investigators and reviewers had to think about roads, traffic, weather, and the sequence of known events. You can imagine a map spread flat on a desk, its paper creased along the fold lines, with Sycamore in one place and Rockford in another. A finger traces a route, a pen marks a time, someone checks an old statement again. The smell of toner hangs in the air, and the office clock ticks with a soft plastic sound that feels too modern for the story it is measuring. That is one of the unusual feelings inside old cases. Modern hands touch old facts. A copy machine warms pages that were once typed by ribbon. A digital clock sits beside witness statements from a town of rotary phones and porch lights. The Ridulph case crossed those worlds more than once, moving from 1957 into 2012, then into the later review that changed the legal outcome. Each era brought its own confidence, and each confidence needed to be tested. When you test an alibi, you are not simply asking whether someone can prove innocence with perfect neatness. You are asking whether the state can prove guilt beyond the weight of reasonable doubt. That difference matters. In quiet terms, it means the burden does not belong to the person accused. It belongs to the case brought against him. You can feel why cold cases make that burden hard. Time has taken witnesses, softened memories, misplaced documents, and left everyone working with what remains. The defense had pointed toward the Rockford evidence, but at trial, the prosecution's theory prevailed. Later, the review looked again
and treated those same details as stronger than the conviction had allowed. The collect call, the travel timing, and the old alibi records were not new in a glittering sense. They had not been found in a hidden drawer behind a false panel. They were part of the history of the case. Their power came from being read with patience. You can pause here and think about how often justice depends on reading. Not just reading words, but reading relationships between words. A time on one page, a place on another. A weather note in a report. A claim in a transcript. A small contradiction but looks harmless until it sits beside something else. In the Ridulph case, the weird evidence was not exotic. It was paperwork that had waited for someone to let it speak in its own slow order. And as you sit with that paper, the next question rises gently, not as a sudden turn, but as another page needing its place in the pile. You return to the figure of Jack McCullough, because the Ridulph case cannot be told carefully without recognizing how his life became bound to the file. He had been John Tessier when the original investigation began, a young man from the neighborhood, known in some ways and unknown in others. By the time he was arrested, many decades later, he was older, under another name, and living with a past that investigators believed had finally caught up with him. You can imagine how strange that must have felt to everyone involved to see 1957 enter the present tense. The arrest itself carried the kind of public meaning that cold cases often gather. Newspapers and broadcasts told the story as a remarkable breakthrough. An old case had a suspect. An old grief had a courtroom. People who had remembered Maria for decades saw the machinery of justice move again. You can understand the relief in that moment without deciding that the relief was proof. Human beings are allowed to want answers, and investigators are still required to test them. McCullough's conviction in 2012 gave the case a shape that many people recognized. A child disappeared. A neighborhood suspect was identified. A long-delayed trial ended with a guilty finding. The story seemed to have the arc that old cases are expected to have when they finally leave the shelf. You can feel how that arc might comfort a community, especially one that had carried the Ridulph case through school anniversaries, police retirements, family funerals, and countless quiet Decembers. Yet the file did not settle. Appeals and post-conviction review brought the evidence back into motion. The same pages that had seemed to support a conclusion were held under different light. You can picture the file as an object now, thick, uneven, perhaps held together in more than one box. Some pages are original. Some are copies of copies. Some bear handwritten notes in margins. Some have paper clips that leave pale rust marks. The case has become physical with age. Richard Schmack's review became important because it did not treat the conviction as the final word. He looked at the alibi evidence and found that the timeline did not support McCullough's guilt. In a system that often values finality, that kind of review takes a particular steadiness. You have to be willing to disappoint people who wanted the case closed. You have to be willing to say the harder thing, which is that a legal answer may have been wrong. That is part of patient detective work too. It is not only finding someone, sometimes it is unfastening a conclusion that was tied too tightly. You can feel the quiet difficulty of that task, because every correction in a case like this touches real people. Maria's loved ones still deserved truth. McCullough still deserved fairness. The public still deserved an honest account of what the evidence could bear. None of those needs cancels the others. The weirdness of the Ridulph evidence lies partly in that doubling. The case was said to be solved by old recognition, old suspicion, and the recovery of a name from the past. Then it was unsolved again by old records, old timing, and the stubborn geography between Rockford and Sycamore. One set of aged evidence closed the door.
Another set opened it. You sit at the desk with both sets before you, and the room feels full of quiet disagreement. A case file is not a single voice. It is a room of voices, some clear, some faint, some mistaken, and some speaking only through numbers or stamps. The investigator's work is not to make them harmonize too early. It is to listen long enough to hear where they do not. You can imagine the pages spread across a table, the photographs placed beside statements, the phone record beside the map, and the old alibi beside the courtroom transcript. Nothing moves quickly here. In the Ridulph case, the court eventually set McCullough's conviction aside, and the prosecution dismissed the charges. Later, the legal finding of innocence made the reversal even clearer. Those steps matter because they tell us where the case stands in law, not just in feeling. A person once convicted was no longer the legal answer to Maria's death. The case returned to being unsolved, not because the need for an answer had faded, but because the answer offered could not hold. You can sit with that without reaching for a sharper ending. The reality is quieter than a dramatic reversal. It is paper corrected by paper. It is a timeline restored to its stubborn shape. It is a judge's order, a prosecutor's review, and a case file that cannot be forced to become simpler than it is. The Ridulph case remains a reminder that patience does not always give us closure. Sometimes patience only tells us where closure was claimed too soon. And when a case returns to the unsolved shelf, the people inside it do not become less real. If anything, they ask for even more care. You turn back toward Maria now, because every file, however complicated, begins and ends around the person who was lost. Maria Ridulph was not a symbol when she stepped outside that evening. She was a 7-year-old child in a cold Illinois town, playing with a friend near home. The case grew huge around her, but the center remains small and human. You can see that in the way old family photographs hold a child's face, not as evidence at first, but as love made visible. It is easy, in long investigations, for names to become parts of arguments. Maria becomes the victim in a case, Kathy becomes the witness. McCullough becomes the defendant, Schmack becomes the reviewing prosecutor. But when you read gently, you let them be people before they are roles. You let the paper breathe. A school photograph is allowed to be a school photograph. A mother's worry is allowed to remain grief, not merely background. This is how we keep the case from becoming cold, in the wrong way. The town of Sycamore also became part of the memory. People who lived there in 1957 remembered where they were, or where their parents were, or how the search changed the feeling of the streets. You can imagine a community where children were watched more closely after that, where porch conversations grew quieter, where certain corners carried a weight no map could show. The Ridulph case did not belong only to investigators. It settled into local life. Cold air is one of the repeating textures of the file. December cold at the beginning, the cold storage of documents, the cool surface of photographs, the chilled distance between what people hoped was true and what evidence could prove. You feel it as you move from page to page, though the room around you is warm. That is one of the strange gifts of old records. They can carry weather forward, not perfectly, but enough to make you pause. The first investigators did not have the language later reviewers would use for memory research, wrongful convictions, or the frailty of old identifications. They had their training, their instincts, and the urgency of a missing child. We can acknowledge their effort without pretending they had tools they did not have. You, as the quiet reader tonight, can hold that balance. The past was not simple. The people in it were not paper figures. They worked under limits that matter. By the time the case was reopened, the country had changed around it. Cold case units had become more familiar. DNA had transformed many investigations, though not every old case had usable biological evidence. Public interest in unsolved cases had grown. Courts had heard more about mistaken identifications.
You can feel the layers of time here, because the Ridulph case was being viewed through newer ideas while still depending on evidence born in an older world. That contrast can help us understand why the case seemed solvable, then less certain. A modern investigator may look at a decades-old witness identification and feel its emotional force. A modern reviewer may look at the same identification and ask how time shaped it. Both reactions begin from human concern. The work is to move beyond reaction into careful testing. You can hear the soft turning of pages again, the quiet insistence of the file asking not to be simplified. Maria's family had endured more waiting than anyone should have to endure. That must be said plainly, without pressing on the pain. Decades passed while the case remained unresolved. Then there was a conviction, and perhaps for some, a sense that the long uncertainty had ended. Then came the reversal, and the uncertainty returned. You can imagine how exhausting that would be, like setting down a heavy box only to be asked, years later, to lift it again. The human heart wants a final page. It wants the name, the proof, the sentence that makes the story stop moving. But cold cases often deny that comfort. The Ridulph case especially asks us to stay with incompleteness, because the evidence that looked like an ending became part of another question. You rest your hand beside the file, and let that be true. We do not help Maria by pretending certainty where certainty failed. This patience is not passive. It is a careful kind of attention. It lets the collect call matter. It lets the witness matter. It lets the family matter. It lets the accused person's rights matter. It lets the map and the weather and the road miles matter. In a good investigation, nothing is too humble to be considered, and nothing is too emotionally powerful to be examined. That is why the next pages of the Ridulph case feel less like a chase and more like a lesson in how evidence ages. Evidence ages in different ways, and in the Ridulph case, each kind of evidence changed at its own pace. Paper became brittle or faded, but it preserved the same words. Memory stayed alive, but it moved through time with the person who carried it. Photographs kept faces still, though the meaning placed on those faces shifted. Official records kept their dry authority, unless someone discovered they had been misunderstood. You can see how a file becomes not one old thing, but many old things aging differently together. A statement taken close to an event has one kind of value. It may capture a detail before later stories can reach it, but it may also reflect confusion, fear, or the pressure of the moment. A statement given decades later has another kind of value. It may come with maturity, reflection, and a lifetime of thinking. It may also come with memory reshaped by all that thinking. You sit with those two truths as though holding two thin sheets up to the light. The Ridulph case contained early reports, later interviews, courtroom testimony, and post-conviction review. Each layer added words. Each word had to be weighed. You can picture a detective or lawyer using a ruler or a finger to follow a typed line, not because the words are difficult, but because accuracy matters. A single time notation can become important. A single location can change what is possible. A single assumption can travel a long way if no one asks it to stop. That is what happened with the alibi evidence in broad shape. Tessier's presence in Rockford had been known, but later review gave that presence stronger force. The collect call from Rockford near the relevant time made the timeline difficult for the prosecution's theory. When road distance and weather were considered, the problem became sharper. You can almost feel the map refusing to fold itself into the story people had accepted. Geography can be patient in that way. A road does not care what a witness remembers. A clock does not care what a prosecutor believes. A receipt does not care whether a town needs peace. These objects and measurements are limited, but their limits can be useful. They cannot tell us everything. They can tell us that certain versions of events require more time than the evening allowed. In the Ridulph case, That modest kind of truth became powerful enough to undo a conviction. There is something humbling about that. A case that carried sorrow for more than half a century turned on details that might look dull in another file. You can imagine the collect call record lying unnoticed among other papers, its numbers and marks waiting without drama. No one would have designed it as a clue. No one would have placed it in a mystery novel as a flourish. It was simply there, part of the ordinary accounting of an ordinary system. The word solved becomes fragile here. The title says weird evidence solved the Ridulph case, and for a time, that was how many people understood it. Yet the deeper lesson is that evidence can appear to solve a case, then solve a different question later. In this file, the evidence did not finally identify Maria's killer. It solved, in the legal sense, the question of whether McCullough's conviction could stand. The answer was no, and that answer mattered. You can let that distinction settle without turning it into an argument. Some listeners may have arrived expecting a tidy cold case ending. The file offers something more honest and more complicated. It offers an old mystery, a conviction, a reversal, and a reminder that patient detective work sometimes protects against our hunger for finality. That may not satisfy the part of us that wants every box labeled. It may satisfy the quieter part that wants the truth treated gently. Truth, in a cold case, can be slower than grief. It can also be slower than accusation. In the Ridulph case, people waited for an answer, then lived through the collapse of one. You can hear the softness of papers being restacked, the lid placed back on a box, the small thud of cardboard against cardboard. The investigation did not become meaningless because the conviction failed. It became more demanding. It asked everyone to be more precise. And precision, in a quiet room, has its own kind of compassion. You now return to the court record, not for drama, but because the Ridulph case passed through law as well as memory. A courtroom is a strange place for an old grief. It asks human pain to fit inside rules of evidence, objections, burdens, findings, and orders. Those rules can feel cold, but they exist for a reason. They slow the story down. They ask whether a thing can be proven, not merely felt. You can hear the murmur of voices lowering when the judge enters. At McCullough's bench trial, there was no jury to persuade with a broad narrative. The judge heard the evidence and made the finding. That setting can seem quieter, almost more contained, yet the weight is not smaller. Witnesses still had to speak. Lawyers still shaped the case. The family still listened. The accused still sat under the gaze of a system deciding his life. You can imagine the table surfaces polished smooth, the water pitchers, the stacks of exhibits, and the heaviness of waiting for a ruling. The prosecution's case rested on the idea that the old pieces, taken together, pointed back to McCullough. Kathy's identification mattered. The family-related statements mattered. The neighborhood connection mattered. The long delay mattered emotionally, though emotion cannot replace proof. When the conviction came, it was treated as the resolution of an extraordinary cold case. Many accounts described it as one of the oldest cases of its kind to be solved. The language of closure settled quickly around it. But legal closure depends on legal strength. After the conviction, defense efforts, and later prosecutorial review pulled the case apart again. You can imagine opening a stitched seam in an old garment, careful not to tear the cloth more than necessary. Each thread is a document, a time, a place, a remembered face. If one thread breaks, the whole garment does not always fail. In the Ridulph case, the timeline thread was not small. It ran through the center. Schmack's later conclusion that McCullough could not have committed the crime, based on the alibi evidence and timing, placed the state in an unusual position. A prosecutor was saying, in effect, that a conviction obtained by the state should not stand. That is a rare and serious posture. It asks the system to correct itself publicly. You can feel the humility required in that act, or at least the humility the act should require. The file had changed the duty. The charges were dismissed after the conviction was vacated, and the later innocence finding gave McCullough's side a legal recognition beyond release. Still, none of that answered what happened to Maria. That is the ache inside this file. Correcting a wrongful conviction does not solve the original crime. It simply removes an answer the evidence could not support. You sit with that and feel how two needs can remain open at once: the need for accountability and the need for accuracy. The Ridulph case, therefore, teaches a quiet distinction between an ending and a correction. An ending tells the listener where to rest. A correction tells the listener where not to rest. It says this path is not the path, even if many people walk down it with good faith or deep hope. That is valuable, though it can feel unsatisfying. In patient detective work, knowing that a road is wrong can save years of wandering, even if the right road remains hidden. You can see how strange the evidence becomes in this light. The same file produced a conviction and its undoing. The same past offered a face and an alibi. The same winter night generated memory and geography. The same town carried grief and doubt. A case is not solved by age alone, nor by sincerity, nor by the public need to close a chapter. It is solved only when the evidence can bear the weight placed on it. As you sit with that principle, you may notice how calm it is. It does not accuse anyone of wanting the wrong thing. It simply asks for carefulness. The Ridulph case deserved carefulness when Maria disappeared. It deserved carefulness when McCullough was accused. It deserved carefulness when the conviction was reviewed.
And it still deserves carefulness now, as an unsolved case whose known history includes both a search for a child and a serious legal reversal. The court pages give way, then, to something quieter again. The ordinary objects that carried the file through time. The ordinary objects are what stay with you after the legal language fades. A photograph with a child's face, a statement typed on aging paper, a map with 2 Illinois towns marked apart, a note about a phone call from Rockford, a travel record connected to a young man's movements. None of these objects is alive, and yet each one has outlasted people who first handled it. You can imagine them stacked in folders, smelling faintly of dust and metal filing cabinets. In the Ridulph case, the physical survival of these records became crucial. If the phone information had vanished, the later review might have been weaker. If the early alibi material had been lost, the timeline might have rested too heavily on memory. Cold case work depends on preservation in a way that is easy to overlook. A clerk who files a page properly may never know that, decades later, someone will need it to protect the truth. There is a gentleness in that thought. Not all patient detective work is done by detectives. Some of it is done by records workers, archivists, secretaries, evidence technicians, and careful people who place a document where it belongs. You can hear the slide of a drawer, the snap of a folder tab, the small scrape of a date stamp. These are quiet sounds, but in a case like Maria Ridulph's, they can matter long after the room is empty. The chain of human care is imperfect, of course. Files are misplaced, labels fade, people retire without explaining their systems. Floods, moves, budget cuts, and ordinary neglect can thin an archive until only fragments remain. That is why the surviving fragments feel so important. You look at them and understand that an old case is partly a contest between forgetting and storage. Every preserved page is a small refusal to let the question disappear completely. The weird evidence in the Ridulph case did not glow with obvious meaning when it was made. A phone company record was a practical thing. A photograph was a family or school thing. A travel document was an administrative thing. But time changed their use. When the case reopened, these ordinary records were invited into a different conversation. They were asked to speak about possibility, identity, distance, and doubt. You can feel how strange that is, and how common. Many cold cases turn on humble evidence. A receipt kept in a drawer, a stamp on an envelope, a notation in a hospital log, a name on the back of a photograph.
These objects do not solve anything by themselves. They wait for context. In the Ridulph case, context was everything. The distance between Rockford and Sycamore mattered only because of the disappearance window. The call mattered only because of where it was placed. The memory mattered only because it connected to a name. That is why we move slowly. If we rush, we turn evidence into decoration. If we slow down, we let it keep its shape. You can place the call record beside the map. You can place Kathy's identification beside what is known about memory. You can place family statements beside the caution required for second-hand recollection. You can place the conviction beside the later innocence finding. Nothing needs to be forced.
The file is patient enough to hold contradictions. The Ridulph case also reminds us that an old answer can be emotionally expensive to question. Once a community has been told that a case is solved, reopening doubt can feel like reopening grief. People may resist not because they dislike truth, but because they have already paid so much for one version of peace. You can be gentle with that too. Human beings do not give up closure easily, especially when closure arrived after decades of waiting. Still, a case cannot be kept closed for comfort alone. The evidence has its own quiet demands. If the timeline cannot work, then the story cannot stand as told. If the alibi places a person elsewhere at the necessary time, then the conviction must be reconsidered. This is not drama. It is the slow discipline of justice. You can almost feel the cool edge of the paper against your fingertips as the file asks for honesty over ease. And once honesty has reopened the case, the old Winter Street returns, waiting for us to look again without pretending we know more than we do. You come back to Center Cross Street and Archie Place because every complicated route through the Ridulph case eventually returns to that corner. The streets are not evidence in the way a document is evidence, but they hold the shape of the beginning. You can imagine the houses in evening light, the slight crust of snow near the curb, the sound of a door opening as a child goes inside for mittens, a small errand, a small absence, a life changed forever. For investigators, locations are anchors. They help keep memory from floating too freely. Where was Maria last seen? Where did Kathy go? Where did the man called Johnny stand? Where were the nearest houses? Which roads led out of town? In the early search, these questions would have been walked physically, not just drawn on paper. Officers and neighbors could look down the block, feel the cold in their faces, and understand distances with their bodies. Decades later, a reviewer might use maps, records, and modern reconstructions, but the need is the same. The case must be placed somewhere. The Ridulph case is not only an idea called an unsolved mystery, it is a place in Sycamore, a route to Rockford, a later discovery near Woodbine, and a network of roads that either permit a theory or refuse it. You can sense how geography becomes a quiet witness, saying little, changing less. The corner where Maria disappeared also tells us something about trust. Children played outside because the world near home felt familiar. Neighbors recognized one another. The ordinary boundaries of safety were drawn by habit, not by formal systems. That does not mean the past was safer in every way. It means people understood danger differently. You sit with that softly, because nostalgia can blur as much as fear can. The file asks for the real town, not an imagined one. The man who called himself Johnny remains one of the central unknowns. If McCullough was not the man, then the identity of Johnny returns to shadow. He may have used a false name. He may have been someone local. He may have been passing through. The evidence does not permit certainty. You can feel how difficult that is after so many years, because a common name spoken to children becomes almost weightless when the person behind it cannot be found. Still, investigators did what investigators do. They gathered descriptions. They compared names. They followed leads outward from Sycamore. They listened when people thought they remembered something. You can hear doors opening to officers in heavy coats. The murmur of adult voices kept low. The scratch of a pencil as someone notes a car. A stranger,
a piece of clothing, or a direction of travel. The early work was immediate, local, and deeply dependent on the community. In cases like this, early hours matter, but they do not guarantee answers. A search can be intense and still fail. Many people can help and still miss the one detail that would have changed everything. That is one of the sad truths that patient detective work must accept. Effort is not the same as certainty. Care is not the same as success. The Ridulph case had both care and effort, and still the answer slipped beyond reach. As the years passed, the corner became memory. Children grew up. Houses changed owners. Cars became different shapes. The sound of the street changed with engines, tires, and the habits of later families. But the case kept the old geography preserved in words. You can read Center Cross and Archie Place now, and feel the past pressed into the names. They are not dramatic names. That is part of their power. They are ordinary, and the case began there. The next folder asks you to move from place back into time, because in this file, minutes became as important as streets. Time in the Ridulph case is not a broad historical sweep at first. It is the narrow span of an evening. When did the girls first see the young man? When did Kathy go home? When was Maria last seen? When did the search begin? When was Tessier in Rockford? When did the collect call occur? You can imagine writing these questions in a column, each one leaving a little space beside it for the answer that may or may not be firm. A timeline looks orderly on paper, but making one from old evidence can be delicate. Witnesses estimate. Clocks differ. People round times without noticing. A child may not know the exact minute. A parent may remember the sequence better than the hour. A record may have a time that is precise, but still needs interpretation. You can feel the patience required. You do not simply stack times and call it truth. You ask what kind of time each time is. The collect call from Rockford carried a different quality than a remembered estimate. It had a recorded structure. That does not make it magical, but it gives it a steadier footing. If Tessier was in Rockford near the time Maria disappeared, then the prosecution's version had to explain travel in a very narrow window. The later review concluded that this explanation did not work. You can sit with that conclusion as a quiet mechanical thing. Gears failing to mesh. Distance can be mercifully plain. Sycamore and Rockford are separated by enough road that a person cannot be in both places at once. Weather adds its own caution. Winter roads can slow travel, and 1957 travel was not the same as modern highway movement. You can imagine headlights on dark pavement, tires hissing over wet patches, a heater blowing unevenly against the windshield. Every mile costs time. Every turn costs time. The map does not bend for desire. This is why the timeline evidence had such force in the later review. It did not depend on proving who Johnny was. It depended on showing who Johnny was not, at least under the state's theory. That is a different kind of resolution. It clears one name without filling the empty space. You might feel the quiet frustration of that, because an exclusion is not the answer the heart asks for. Yet exclusions are essential. They keep the file honest. In the courtroom, old timing questions can become abstract, but at the desk tonight, you can make them tangible again. A clock face, a road map, a winter evening, a payphone or phone booth in Rockford, a mother receiving a collect call, a child in Sycamore. These images do not have to be heightened. They simply sit beside one another, and the space between them becomes the question. Could a person move through that space in time? The later answer was no. The Ridulph case therefore became a lesson in negative proof. Not proof of the killer, but proof that one legal conclusion could not stand. That kind of proof is often quieter than identification, but it may be more reliable. It says, here is a boundary. Here is what the record will not allow. In old cases, boundaries matter. Without them, grief and suspicion can expand until they cover too much. You can imagine the reviewer returning again and again to the same minutes, perhaps hoping the problem would resolve differently. A fair review does not begin by wanting the conviction to fail. It begins by asking whether the conviction can survive careful reading. The phone record, travel time, and related alibi materials kept answering in the same direction. The paper did not become louder. It simply remained steady. That steadiness is one of the reasons the Ridulph case still feels important. It shows how an old file can contain both a powerful accusation and the means to challenge it. It shows why preservation matters, and why review matters, and why even celebrated cold case convictions must be able to withstand scrutiny. You let that thought settle, not as a lecture, but as a quiet principle learned from a long winter file. From time, the file returns again to people, because evidence only matters because people were harmed, accused, remembered, and left waiting. Kathy's place in the Ridulph case is especially tender. She was a child witness, and then she became an adult witness, carrying a memory that no child should have had to carry. You can imagine how often people may have asked her about that evening, formally and informally, with kindness or curiosity or pressure. Each telling would have required her to return. The cold air, the mittens, the name Johnny, the absence when she came back. Some memories do not stay in the past. When she later identified McCullough, she did so from within that long burden. The fact that the conviction was later vacated does not mean her pain was false or her effort careless. It means the legal system ultimately found that the evidence as a whole could not support the conviction. That distinction is important. We can honor her experience without requiring her memory to do more than memory can safely do. You and I can hold that gently. Eyewitness testimony has helped solve many cases, and it has also contributed to wrongful convictions. Both statements are true. The mind can preserve startling detail, and the mind can be influenced by time, suggestion, repetition, and the desire to make sense of trauma. In the Ridulph case, the long delay made these questions unavoidable. A face remembered after more than 50 years carries emotional weight, but the law must ask whether it carries enough proof. You can picture the identification process itself, not in sharp detail, but as a quiet administrative act with enormous consequence. Photographs arranged or shown, an old face compared to an older memory, a person asked to say whether this is the man. The room might have been calm, but the meaning was heavy. A small movement of recognition can travel into an arrest, a trial, and a conviction. That is why the process must be handled with great care. The human need for recognition is deep. When something terrible happens, people want the unknown person to become known. A name feels like a light coming on. It organizes grief. It gives anger somewhere to go. It lets a community say, "This was the one." But if the name is wrong, the light misleads everyone. The Ridulph case asks us to be patient with that need, and also patient enough to resist it when the evidence does not support it. McCullough's life was also changed profoundly by the accusation and conviction. A calm account has to say that plainly. He was imprisoned after being found guilty, and later the conviction was set aside. The legal recognition of innocence did not erase the years lost to the process. You can hold that fact without taking attention away from Maria. Justice is not a scale where compassion for one person must be stolen from another. The file is large enough for more than one human cost. This is part of what makes old cases so difficult. By the time an arrest happens decades later, everyone is already carrying history. Witnesses are older. Families have endured long silence. Suspects have lived whole lives. Investigators may feel the weight of a chance that will not come again. The public may want the past repaired at last. In that atmosphere, evidence has to be steadier than emotion. The Ridulph case shows how hard that can be. A quiet detective, reading late, would know this. You cannot let your sympathy choose the facts. You cannot let your doubt become indifference. You keep returning to the paper, the map, the testimony, and the times. You let each person remain human. You let the unknown remain unknown, where it must. The work is not cold because it lacks feeling. It is careful
because feeling is everywhere. The next pages of the file carry us back to the investigation's long afterlife, where public memory and legal record did not always move together. Public memory often prefers a clean sentence. The Ridulph case was solved. The Ridulph case was reopened. The Ridulph case was unsolved again. Each sentence is easier than the life underneath it. You can hear how the words flatten decades into a line or two. But as we sit with the file tonight, we let the story keep its full weight. The case was investigated, revived, prosecuted, overturned, and left open, with real people affected at every stage. When the conviction first came, many reports treated it as a remarkable achievement. That is understandable. Cold cases solved after many decades carry a particular fascination, especially when the victim was a child and the town had remembered for so long. The phrase "oldest cold case" can gather attention quickly. It gives the story a place in public imagination. You can see headlines being written, concise and certain, while the actual file remains thick and complicated. After the reversal, the public story became more difficult to tell. It required people to understand that a conviction could be celebrated and then undone. It required space for legal nuance. It required attention to evidence that was not dramatic to describe. A collect call and a travel timeline do not fit easily into a short headline. They are quiet details, and quiet details can be crowded out by louder stories. That is why we give them room here. You can imagine a listener years ago hearing that Maria's case had been solved and feeling a measure of peace. Then later, perhaps, hearing that the conviction had been vacated and feeling confusion. Which story was true? Which ending counted? The honest answer is that the later legal status matters. McCullough is not the solved answer to the Ridulph case. The case remains unsolved, even though it once passed through a period when many believed it had been closed. That kind of public correction can leave people uneasy. It asks them to revise a memory of closure. It may feel like the floor shifting under a story they had already filed away, but truth is allowed to revise us. In fact, that is one of the gentler lessons of patient investigation. We are not required to stay loyal to a mistaken certainty. We can set it down carefully, thank it for what it tried to be, and return to the evidence. The Ridulph case also shows why cold case storytelling must be cautious. A narrator can do harm by making the story too neat. If we say only that weird evidence solved the case, we lose the later truth. If we say only that the conviction failed, we lose the decades of searching and the sincere effort to find Maria's killer. The calm path is to keep both in view. The file deserves no less. You can feel how the story resists speed. Every time it seems ready to become simple, another page slows it down. A memory asks to be honored and questioned. A conviction asks to be understood and overturned. A phone call asks to be noticed. A family's grief asks not to be used as decoration. A wrongly convicted man's legal innocence asks not to be treated as an inconvenience. This is what patient detective work is made of. There is no need to raise the voice. The facts themselves are enough. The old winter, the missing child, the witness, the neighborhood suspect, the conviction, the alibi record, the reversal, the open case. Each piece can be placed on the table with care, like objects from a box whose owner is no longer there. You do not slam them down. You let them rest where they belong. And when all those pieces are resting in front of you, the quietest question remains the same. One Sycamore had at the beginning. Who was the man who called himself Johnny, and where did he go after the corner fell silent? The Ridulph case keeps returning to that question, not with urgency, but with the steady patience of a clock left running in an empty room. You can sit with it without trying to answer too quickly. The file has already shown us what can happen when a longed-for answer is allowed to harden before every old piece has been tested. In the first days of the search, Johnny was a description, a name, and a directionless absence.
You can imagine investigators asking neighbors whether they knew someone like that, whether any young man had been seen near the girls, whether a car had idled nearby, whether anyone had noticed footsteps in snow or a stranger's voice. The houses would have held warm kitchen smells, damp wool drying near radiators, and adults lowering their voices when children came close. Every answer may have felt useful for a moment, then incomplete again. Descriptions from children can be delicate things. They may notice what adults miss, and miss what adults would record first. A child might remember friendliness, height in relation to her own small body, hair, a word, a smile, or the way someone bent down to speak. You can feel the investigators trying to translate those impressions into a search tool. They needed something specific enough to guide them, yet gentle enough not to distort the memory they were receiving. The name Johnny could have been true, or it could have been chosen because it was harmless and common. In the Ridulph case, that uncertainty matters. A false name can be a small shield. A real name can be a stroke of carelessness. A nickname can sit somewhere between the two. You turn that page and see how much work one ordinary name created. It gave investigators something to hold, but not enough to close their hands around. As the search widened, the investigation would have taken in rumors, sightings, and fears that came from beyond Sycamore. People often see missing children after a case becomes public. Sometimes they see a resemblance in a bus station or a store aisle. Sometimes they remember a car because the story has given the car meaning. You can be grateful for their concern and still know how much labor it creates. Every possible sighting asks for time, travel, interviews, and disappointment. That early work had a physical rhythm: doors, notebooks, phones, maps, and long evenings under office light. You can hear a receiver returning to its cradle, a drawer sliding open, a file being placed on a desk with a flat sound. The Ridulph case did not move through glowing screens then. It moved through voices, paper, and the patience of people trying to turn fragments into direction. The slowness was not a style, it was the world they had. Federal attention added another layer, but it did not make the central uncertainty vanish. A larger agency can bring manpower, coordination, and experience, yet it still depends on evidence. You can picture the difference between the small local office and the wider investigative network: letters moving, calls logged, names checked against lists. The case became bigger than one town, but the first facts remained small. 2 girls, a winter corner, a man using the name Johnny, one child not coming home. When Maria was found months later, the unknown man became part of a homicide investigation, and the file darkened without needing any dramatic words. You do not need details beyond that. The discovery confirmed that the search had not ended as people prayed it would. Afterward, investigators were no longer asking only where Maria was. They were asking who had taken her from the corner, how he left Sycamore, and why the early net had not held him. That transition from search to homicide file can be felt in the paperwork. Reports become more formal. The language grows careful. Evidence is listed, timelines refined, leads categorized and recategorized. You can imagine the file growing heavier, not just with pages but with the knowledge that each page had failed to bring Maria back. Still, the work continued. That is one of the plain mercies of investigation. Even when hope changes shape, duty remains. And as duty continued, the first suspect lists began to age, carrying names forward into years none of the early detectives could see. The Ridulph case, like many old investigations, became a place where generations of law enforcement met one another through paper. An officer in the 1950s wrote a note, and a detective decades later read it under different lights, with different training and different doubts. You can imagine the younger reader trying to hear the older writer clearly. Was this phrase certain, or merely convenient? Did this omission mean nothing was known, or only that no one thought to write it down? That is one of the great challenges of cold case work. The past does not explain its own paperwork. A blank line may be meaningless, or it may hide a lost conversation. A checked box may have been careful or hurried. A witness statement may have been typed from notes that no longer exist. You sit with the Ridulph file and feel how much humility this requires. The page is evidence, but it is also the shadow of a human process. By the time investigators returned to McCullough, the old file had become both guide and trap. It pointed toward questions that still mattered, but it also carried assumptions from earlier eras. You can see how easy it would be to read a neighborhood connection as more meaningful after years of silence. Someone nearby becomes someone possible. Someone possible becomes someone worth revisiting. That is not wrong by itself. It is investigation. The danger comes when possibility begins to imitate proof. McCullough's earlier life as John Tessier placed him in the orbit of Sycamore, and that fact had investigative value. He was not invented by later suspicion. He had been part of the early case history. Yet the later review showed that being in the orbit is not the same as being at the center. You can imagine a diagram with circles around the Ridulph home, around the street corner, around Rockford, each circle honest in its own way, none allowed to swallow the others. There is a lesson here about proximity. People close to a crime scene often deserve attention because many cases are solved by looking nearby, but proximity can mislead when it becomes emotional shorthand. A person known to the neighborhood may feel more real than an unknown stranger, and realness can harden into suspicion. In the Ridulph case, the old alibi records mattered partly because they resisted that hardening. They said, "Look at where he was," not only where he had lived. You can feel the carefulness of that distinction in your hands, like separating two thin pages stuck together by age. One page says neighborhood, another says Rockford. One page says recognition, another says phone call. One page says old suspicion, another says travel time. The task is not to choose the more dramatic page. The task is to read all of them, slowly enough that none tears as you lift it. The cold case investigators who reopened the file were not working in bad faith simply because the conviction later failed. That matters too. People can be sincere and mistaken. They can be diligent and still overvalue one kind of evidence. They can inherit a story that feels nearly complete and overlook the old nail holding it crooked. You and I can let that be part of the human record without turning the account sharp or cynical. This is why the Ridulph case is so suited to patient retelling. It does not reward a raised voice. It asks for the tone of a person sitting late in an archive, reading not only for what the file says, but for what the file may have been trying to say for years. The fluorescent lights hum. The air is dry. The paper edges rasp softly against one another. Somewhere in the building, a door closes with a padded echo. As the file moves toward trial, the evidence begins to change form again, leaving the archive and entering the courtroom's stricter language. In court, every piece of the Ridulph case had to become presentable. Memories became testimony. Photographs became exhibits. Family recollections became questions asked under oath. Alibi records became arguments about time and distance. You can picture the transformation as a kind of careful packing, each item wrapped in procedure before being carried into view. The courtroom does not simply receive a file. It reshapes it according to rules older than any one case. That reshaping can clarify, but it can also narrow. A witness's long emotional history may become a few lines of testimony. A document's administrative origin may be reduced to the single fact it seems to prove. A photograph's human warmth may become identification evidence. You can sit with that tension quietly. The legal system needs focus, but human stories do not always fit without losing texture. In the Ridulph case, texture mattered because so much time had passed. The trial judge had to weigh what remained from 1957 against what was said decades later. That is not an easy task. Time had removed the possibility of many fresh checks. Some original investigators were gone. Some witnesses had aged or died. The community memory had become layered with public retellings. You can almost feel the courtroom air holding two eras at once, the old Winter Street and the modern legal proceeding, both asking for attention. Kathy's testimony carried the emotional force of continuity. She was the living bridge from the evening itself to the courtroom. When she spoke, the distance between the child witness and the adult proceeding narrowed. You can imagine people listening differently when she described the man called Johnny. Her voice would have carried not only content, but survival. Still, the law had to ask whether recognition after so long could support the weight being placed upon it. Family-related statements added another delicate layer. Memories of what someone said near the end of life can feel sacred to a family, and yet they can be difficult to test. You can imagine how a phrase might pass from one person to another, gaining certainty as it moves through grief, suspicion, and time. That does not make the teller dishonest. It means the courtroom must be cautious. The Ridulph case contained this kind of human difficulty in abundance. The prosecution's story had coherence. It connected the neighborhood, the name, the later identification, and old family suspicion. A coherent story can be powerful because our minds are made to rest inside patterns. You can feel the comfort of a pattern forming. After decades of open questions, here was a line that seemed to run from the corner in Sycamore to a man who had once lived nearby. It was understandable that the line drew attention. The defense story depended on time and place. It asked the court to look at Rockford, the core, and the travel realities. That kind of story may feel less emotionally complete because it does not answer who harmed Maria. It simply says this accused man could not have been there. You can sense why such an argument may have struggled beside the human force of remembered childhood. Yet in law, an alibi does not need to name the real offender to matter. When the conviction came, it seemed to many as though the old file had finally reached its last page. But even then, some pages had not been heard in the way they would later need to be heard. The collect call record, the military processing timeline, and the practical distance between towns remained in the file's bloodstream. They would continue to circulate after the trial, quietly carrying the objection that eventually changed everything. That is how evidence can wait even after a verdict. It does not disappear because a court has spoken. It remains in transcripts, exhibits, archives, and the minds of people who continue reading. The Ridulph case teaches that patient detective work can continue after conviction too, especially when a timeline sits uneasily beneath the official story. You turn another page, and the light over the desk seems a little cooler. From the courtroom, the path leads into post-conviction review, where the same evidence had to be approached with less certainty and more care. Post-conviction review is not the part of a case most people imagine when they hear the word investigation. It has fewer searches, fewer interviews in the public mind, fewer images of officers in the field, but it can be some of the most patient work of all. You sit indoors with transcripts, motions, old exhibits, and claims of error. You compare what was said to what could be proven. You ask whether the system has carried a mistake forward. In the Ridulph case, that review became unusually significant because the DeKalb County State's Attorney's Office itself eventually took the position that McCullough was innocent. That is not a small procedural footnote. It is a moment when a state actor looked back at a conviction and found it could not stand. You can imagine the heaviness of that conclusion, the quiet of the office after hours, the sense that every word in the review would matter to someone. The alibi evidence was central. The record of the collect call from Rockford, combined with other time-related material, made the window too narrow under the later analysis. You can place those items on the table again: the call, the route, the weather, the disappearance time, the known movements. Each object or fact is modest alone, but together they form a boundary. The boundary says that the prosecution's version cannot fit without bending time too far. There is a calm strength in evidence that says no. It may not give the answer we want, but it protects us from a false answer. You can think of it as a fence around uncertainty. Inside the fence, many questions remain. Outside it, one claim cannot pass. In the Ridulph case, the fence formed around McCullough's alibi. It did not solve Maria's disappearance. It prevented one legal solution from continuing to call itself settled. The review also showed how easy it can be for old evidence to be undervalued when a case has a compelling human narrative. A child witnesses later identification and a family's long suspicion make a story that feels alive. A phone record feels dry. Travel time feels mechanical. But justice cannot rank evidence by emotional warmth. Sometimes, the coldest document in the folder carries the clearest light. You can feel that light falling across the map, pale and steady. McCullough's release and the vacating of his conviction did not create a joyous ending. It created a corrected record, and then a silence where the supposed answer had been. That kind of silence is difficult. You can imagine Maria's family and community facing the renewed absence of certainty. You can also imagine McCullough facing the aftermath of conviction, imprisonment and vindication. The file does not ask you to choose which pain counts. It asks you to recognize each one. In cases that pass through wrongful conviction claims, people sometimes fear that attention to the accused will eclipse the victim. But accuracy serves the victim too. A wrong conviction does not honor Maria. It leaves the real question unanswered while pretending otherwise. You can sit with that slowly, because it may be the deepest ethical thread in the Ridulph case. The search for truth must be truthful itself, or it becomes another injury laid over the first. The legal finding of innocence in 2017 marked a formal recognition that McCullough should not remain tied to the case as the guilty man. That finding changed his legal status, but it did not rewrite the long public memory overnight. Public stories can lag behind court records. People may remember the arrest more vividly than the exoneration. That, too, is part of the harm when an old case moves too quickly toward closure. You can feel why careful wording matters. To say McCullough solved the case is wrong. To say the Ridulph case was never seriously investigated is also wrong. To say the evidence was simple is wrong in another way. The most truthful sentence is slower. The case was investigated for decades. A conviction was obtained, then the conviction was vacated and dismissed, and McCullough was declared innocent while Maria's case remained unsolved. The sentence is longer because the truth is longer, and after that long sentence, the file seems to breathe out, not finished, but more honestly arranged. You might now imagine the evidence room where the Ridulph case materials rested after the legal reversal. There may not be one single room matching the picture in your mind, but the image helps us hold the quiet work of storage. Metal shelves, labeled boxes, fluorescent light, a slight chill in the air, the smell of cardboard, dust, and institutional floor cleaner. Somewhere in those records is the story of a case that almost accepted an answer and then had to let it go. The physicality of the evidence matters because time keeps moving. Paper can be rescanned, transcripts can be digitized, photographs can be preserved more carefully, but every act of preservation is also an interpretation of value. Someone must decide the file is worth keeping accessible. In the Ridulph case, that worth is clear. It is a record of Maria's life and loss, a record of investigative persistence, and a record of how the justice system corrected a grave mistake. Cold case units often speak of fresh eyes, and the phrase is common because it is useful. Fresh eyes do not mean wiser eyes by default. They mean eyes, not bound by every assumption made before. They may see a contradiction where others saw clutter. They may ask why a timeline was accepted. They may notice that one old page was never placed beside another. You can feel the value of that in this case, where the old alibi evidence needed a reader willing to slow down. There is also such a thing as tired eyes. A case reviewed too often can become familiar in a dangerous way. The reader begins to see what is expected. The famous details glow, while the dull ones recede. You can guard against that by reading as though each page has not yet made up its mind. The Ridulph file rewards that habit. Its dull evidence became decisive. Its famous evidence became uncertain. Its supposed ending became another chapter. You can almost hear the file whispering that nothing should be skipped because it seems ordinary. A phone call, a weather note, a road distance, a prior statement, a name change, an old photograph. Each item might be harmless, or it might alter the case. The investigator's task is not to love every clue equally. It is to give each one the attention it deserves before deciding how much weight it can bear. That attention takes time, and time is the real atmosphere of the Ridulph case. Time between Maria's disappearance and the discovery months later. Time between the first investigation and the renewed focus on McCullough. Time between conviction and exoneration. Time still passing now, with the case open and the original answers harder to reach. You can feel the layers like blankets folded over one another, each one softening the shape beneath, while adding its own weight.
There is a temptation to treat old cases as puzzles, but they are more than puzzles. A puzzle exists to be solved cleanly. A case exists because someone was harmed, and because the harm left a disorder that real people lived inside. The Ridulph case contains puzzle-like elements, certainly. Timelines, witness statements, records, and contradictions. But it is not a game. It is a human record. And that is why our pace stays gentle. You can sit back for a moment in the imagined archive chair, feeling the fabric of it under your arms, the floor cool beneath your shoes. Outside, perhaps, the evening has settled. Inside, the file remains open. You are not required to solve it tonight. You are only asked to read honestly. That posture, humble and attentive, may be the best way to approach an old mystery that has already shown the danger of wanting too much too fast. From the evidence room, our attention drifts back again to the people who kept the case alive, because without memory, even preserved paper can sleep unread. Families often become the first archivists of cold cases. They keep photographs, clippings, letters, and anniversaries. They correct strangers who remember details badly. They carry the name of the person lost into rooms where the official file is not present. In the Ridulph case, Maria's family lived with decades of uncertainty, and that kind of waiting has a texture all its own. It is not always loud. Much of it happens at kitchen tables, in quiet bedrooms, and during ordinary errands that suddenly catch on a memory. You can imagine a family member opening a drawer and seeing an old photograph, the paper slightly curled, the child in the image unchanged while everyone around her has aged. That is one of the particular cruelties of an unsolved child case. The child remains fixed in time, while siblings, parents, friends, and neighbors move forward because life requires it. The file may grow, but the photograph stays the same. In Maria's case, that stillness became part of the public memory of Sycamore. Frances Ridulph, Maria's mother, carried the loss through the rest of her life. We do not need to imagine her thoughts in any intrusive way. It is enough to acknowledge the long endurance required. Every new lead may have brought a small lift of possibility. Every disappointment may have settled back into the old weight. You can feel the tenderness of that without pressing on it. The case file records facts, but families live with the spaces between them. Kathy, too, held a form of witness memory that was not chosen. Children who survive proximity to tragedy may become custodians of details they never asked to keep. You can imagine the winter corner returning at odd times, perhaps with the smell of snow, perhaps with the remembered feel of mittens, perhaps with the sound of a name. The Ridulph case asked her to give that memory to investigators, then to revisit it decades later under public and legal scrutiny. Investigators also carried the case, though in another way. Some may have retired with it unresolved. Some may have believed one theory, then another. Some may have handed the file to younger officers with a few spoken notes that never made it into writing. In old cases, institutional memory is fragile.
A detective's sense of which lead mattered can vanish when the detective dies, unless the reasoning was written down clearly. The Ridulph file likely held many such human traces. You can think of a cold case as a long relay where the baton is made of paper. One person passes it to another, sometimes carefully, sometimes hurriedly, sometimes after years in storage. The next person must decide where to run. In Maria's case, that relay lasted across generations, from the searchers in 1957 to the investigators and lawyers of the 21st century. The baton was not always carried perfectly, but it was not dropped completely. That matters because forgetting is the easiest outcome for old cases. Not intentional forgetting, perhaps, but the natural fading that happens when people move, die, retire, or become overwhelmed by newer emergencies. The Ridulph case resisted that fading because Maria's name remained known. The unsolved nature of the case became part of its endurance. People kept returning to it, sometimes with hope, sometimes with theory, sometimes with a need to repair what history had left open. The difficulty is that memory can preserve and distort at the same time. A community may remember the emotional truth of a case, but not every factual detail. A family may remember suspicion, but suspicion is not proof. A witness may remember a face, but memory is not a recording. A prosecutor may remember the ache of a family's waiting, but ache cannot close a timeline gap. The Ridulph case asks all these memories to stand near evidence without replacing it. You can see why the case is still studied. It is not only because Maria's story is tragic, though it is. It is because the investigation became a lesson in how old cases can go wrong and still be corrected. It shows the value of persistence and the danger of persistence when it seeks confirmation more than truth. That dual lesson is quiet, but it is important. The same patience that reopens a file must also be patient enough to doubt its own answer. And doubt, handled gently, is not the enemy of care. It is one of the ways care protects the living and the dead. Doubt in the Ridulph case had to be disciplined. It could not be a vague feeling that maybe something was wrong. It had to rest on evidence. The Rockford call, the timeline, the travel realities, and the old alibi materials gave doubt a structure. You can imagine doubt becoming almost architectural, with beams and supports, not floating mist. That kind of doubt can stand in court. It can hold weight. It can open a locked conclusion. At the same time, doubt did not erase the original investigation's urgency or the sorrow at its center. A careful reader does not swing from certainty to cynicism. You do not say the whole case was meaningless because one conviction failed. You say the file was more complicated than the conviction allowed. You say the truth had not been reached. You say Maria still deserved an answer, and McCullough should not have carried a guilt the evidence could not support. This balanced posture can be hard for public conversation, but it is natural in a quiet study. Here, under a small lamp, we have time for more than one thing to be true. We can respect the officers who searched in the cold. We can respect the family's need for answers. We can respect Kathy's burden as a witness. We can respect the legal correction that cleared McCullough. We can respect the unknown by refusing to fill it carelessly. You can feel how much of the Ridulph case is about restraint. The restraint not to describe violence. The restraint not to overstate memory. The restraint not to turn suspicion into fact. The restraint not to call a case solved because a story feels complete. Restraint may sound like an absence, but in investigative work, it is a strong tool. It keeps the file from being bent into the shape we prefer. The alibi evidence is a good example of restraint because it does not try to answer everything. It simply says, attend to this. A person in Rockford at a recorded time cannot also be in Sycamore unless the timeline allows the journey. If the journey cannot fit, the accusation cannot stand. The simplicity is almost restful. After pages of memory and grief, the map and the clock offer a quieter kind of firmness. You might imagine laying a transparent sheet over the evening, marking the known points as small dots. Maria and Kathy near the corner, Kathy going home for mittens. The moment Maria is gone, Tessier in Rockford, the collect call, the road between towns. The dots do not form the prosecution's picture under later review. They leave a gap too wide to ignore. That gap became one of the most important spaces in the entire file. It is strange to think of an empty space as evidence, but in timelines, absence can speak. The absence of enough travel time, the absence of a reliable bridge between Rockford and Sycamore, the absence of proof that the accused could be where the state needed him to be. These absences are not dramatic. They are not visual in the way a photograph is visual. Yet they can be decisive, because a case must fit the world as it is. The world as it is includes weather, roads, clocks, human limits, and the imperfection of memory. The Ridulph case brought all of those together. It began with a winter evening and a child's recollection. It moved through decades of public memory. It reached a courtroom. It returned to paper. It arrived at an innocence finding. The path is winding, but not frantic. It is the path of a file being read again and again by people trying to understand what the old pages allow. Now, as the night deepens around the imagined desk, we can look more closely at why the evidence felt so unusual to those who followed the case. The phrase weird evidence can sound playful, but in the Ridulph case, the weirdness is really the odd dignity of ordinary things. A collect call record is not meant to carry moral weight. It is a service record, a note in a system built to connect voices and bill accounts. Yet this small administrative trace became one of the most important items in deciding whether a man had been wrongly convicted. You can see how the everyday becomes solemn when time passes over it. A train or travel record has a similar plainness. It exists because someone had to go somewhere, or because an institution needed to track movement. It may have been folded into a pocket, handled at a counter, stored with other papers, then nearly forgotten. Later, in the Ridulph case, such material became part of the question of where Tessier was and what movements were possible. The object did not change. The question around it did. Photographs are stranger still. They appear to freeze identity, but they do not freeze interpretation. A young man in an old photograph can be seen as a neighbor, a suspect, a memory prompt, or a mistaken match, depending on who is looking and why. A child in a family photograph can be seen as beloved, missing, publicly remembered, or legally significant. You can feel the smooth surface of a photograph and still know that what people see in it is never purely surface. The Ridulph case gathered these objects and placed them under pressure. The pressure of grief, the pressure of public attention, the pressure of a court case, the pressure of a later review. Under pressure, some evidence held and some did not. The phone and timing evidence held strongly enough to help overturn the conviction. The identification evidence, though sincere, could not overcome that alibi problem. The old family suspicion could not make the road shorter or the clock slower. That is why the file's lesson is not that one type of evidence is always better than another. It is that every piece must be tested in relation to the whole. A record can be misread. A memory can be accurate. A photograph can help. A timeline can be incomplete. There are no shortcuts. You and I sit with the full arrangement because that is what the case requires. Anything less would be too easy. The weird evidence also reminds us that solving and unsolving can both come from the same habit of looking again. Investigators looked again and found McCullough. Reviewers looked again and cleared him. The moral difference lies not in the act of reopening, but in how faithfully each conclusion follows the evidence. Patient work is not guaranteed to be right merely because it is patient. It must also be self-correcting. Self-correction is a quiet virtue. It has no grand music behind it. It often feels like embarrassment, disappointment, or institutional discomfort. Yet it is essential. In the Ridulph case, the correction mattered because it removed a false endpoint and returned the file to its unresolved truth.
You can imagine the case file after the correction. Not lighter exactly, but less wrongly labeled. The tag solved no longer belonged where it had been placed. There is sadness in that, and there is also integrity. An unsolved case honestly named is better than a solved case falsely closed. Maria's memory deserves the honest naming. McCullough's life required it. The investigators who may work the case in the future need it. A false solution can block the path for everyone, because once a case is believed closed, the real unknown is left unpursued. The Ridulph case had to be opened again to tell the truth about itself. And once reopened, it asks a quieter question about what future work can still mean after so much time has gone by. Future work in a case like Maria Ridulph's is difficult, but not meaningless. Some witnesses are gone. Some memories have faded. Some physical evidence may be limited or unusable, but cold case work does not depend only on dramatic new technology. Sometimes it depends on organizing what already exists. Sometimes it depends on finding a forgotten statement, comparing old maps, or recognizing that a lead dismissed long ago was never fully checked. You can picture a modern investigator reviewing the Ridulph case with both caution and humility. They would know the danger of overconfidence because the case has already demonstrated it. They would need to separate what is known from what is believed, and what is believed from what is merely repeated. That sorting is patient work. It may involve spreadsheets, scanned documents, interviews, and long hours with quiet coffee cooling beside a keyboard. Digital tools can help, but they cannot replace judgment. A database can organize names. It cannot decide what compassion requires. Mapping software can estimate travel. It cannot feel the weight of a family's waiting. Searchable transcripts can find a phrase. They cannot tell whether the phrase was misunderstood unless a person reads it carefully. In the Ridulph case, technology may assist, but the essential work remains human and slow. The case's age means that any new lead would need careful verification. A person might come forward with a family story. An old document might appear in private hands. A forgotten photograph might surface. Each would be interesting, but interest is not proof. You can imagine setting a new item beside the old file, not with excitement, but with attention. Does it fit the timeline? Does it match known geography? Can it be corroborated? Has it been shaped by publicity? That last question matters because famous cases develop a fog of retelling. Details enter public knowledge, and then later witnesses may repeat them without realizing where they learned them. The Ridulph case, because it received national attention at different points, carries that risk. A new memory would have to be handled gently, but carefully. You would not dismiss it. You would not embrace it too quickly. You would let it sit in the light until its edges were clear. If forensic evidence remains, modern methods could theoretically be considered, though we should not pretend that every old case has preserved material capable of yielding answers. Time, storage conditions, and the nature of the original evidence all matter. The Ridulph case is not one we should turn into a fantasy of technology. Its known lesson is more grounded. The evidence that changed the legal outcome was not a laboratory miracle. It was careful review of records. That may be why the case feels so fitting for a quiet night. It shows that attention itself can be consequential. A person reads the page again. A person checks the time again. A person refuses to ignore a call record because a story already seems complete. There is something almost meditative in that. The file does not move quickly, and neither do we. We let the details align or fail to align at their own pace. For Maria, any future answer would have to meet the standard the case now demands.
It would have to be stronger than longing, stronger than a remembered name alone, stronger than an old suspicion, stronger than the relief of closure. It would need records, corroboration, and a timeline that holds. The Ridulph case has earned that seriousness through its long and painful path. It cannot be allowed another answer that only seems to fit. You turn the page again, and the paper makes that soft, dry sound that belongs to old files and late hours. The Ridulph case is also a study in how a town lives with uncertainty. Sycamore was not frozen in 1957, though the case may make it feel that way in memory. People continued to work, marry, raise children, move away, return, and grow old. Streets were repaired. Businesses changed. New generations learned the name Maria Ridulph as something that belonged to local history before they were born. You can feel how a case becomes part of a place's weather. For those who were there, the memory was not history at first. It was lived experience. A missing child changes how parents call children home. It changes how neighbors look at unfamiliar cars. It changes the tone of winter evenings. You can imagine porch lights staying on a little longer, conversations pausing when police cars passed, and families holding children close in ways that children may not have understood. The Ridulph case entered ordinary life through small changes like that. As decades passed, the case likely became both personal and inherited. Someone who had been a child in Sycamore might tell their own children about Maria. A newer resident might learn the story from an older neighbor. A local article might appear on an anniversary. The case moved from immediate fear into community memory, and then into a broader cold case narrative. You can see how each stage changes the way people speak about it. Community memory can preserve compassion, but it can also preserve suspicion. Names linger, hints become law. A person once questioned may remain shadowed in local talk long after the official file has moved elsewhere. That is another reason the McCullough reversal matters. When a legal system corrects a conviction, public memory has to do its own slower correction. It must loosen the old label, even if the story had become familiar. You can imagine how hard that might be in a town that had waited so long. To be told, after decades, that the case had been solved could feel like a burden lifted from the town itself. To be told later that the solution had failed could feel like being returned to the first winter. Yet truth cannot be measured by emotional convenience. The Ridulph case asks the community, like the rest of us, to live with the harder version rather than the easier wrong one. There is dignity in that living. An unsolved case does not mean a forgotten case. It can mean a community continues to speak a name with care while refusing to attach the wrong name to guilt. It can mean schools, families, and local historians remember Maria without turning the story into rumor. It can mean the file remains available for future attention. The quiet work of memory continues, even when the legal answer is absent. You can think of Sycamore, at night now, many years after the first winter, with different cars along the curbs and different lamps in the windows. The past is not visible on every porch, but it is not gone. Somewhere in the town's memory, the corner remains. The cold air remains. The name Maria remains. The question remains. You do not have to make that image heavy. It is heavy enough on its own. And from the town, the file draws us back to the central discipline that runs through every old investigation, separating what we know from what we wish. What we know in the Ridulph case begins with Maria's disappearance on the 3rd of December, 1957, in Sycamore, Illinois. We know she had been outside with Kathy near home. We know Kathy described a young man who called himself Johnny. We know Maria was later found in April of 1958 near Woodbine. We know the case remained unresolved for decades. These are the stones at the bottom of the stream, steady beneath moving water. We also know that Jack McCullough, formerly John Tessier, was later accused, tried, and convicted in 2012. We know that conviction was vacated in 2016, that the charges were dismissed, and that he was declared innocent in 2017. We know the Rockford alibi evidence, including the collect call and timing analysis, played a central role in undoing the conviction. Those facts do not solve Maria's case, but they define the truthful boundaries of the modern record. What people wished is also understandable. They wished Maria had been found alive. They wished the first investigation had captured the person responsible. They wished decades of waiting had produced a reliable answer. They wished the conviction had brought peace that could remain. You can hold those wishes tenderly. They are not foolish wishes. They are the natural shape of love and grief when a case has been open too long. But wishes cannot decide the file. That is the quiet rule we keep returning to. The evidence must be allowed to say less than people need it to say. In the Ridulph case, it says McCullough's conviction could not stand. It does not say who Johnny was. It says the old winter remains unresolved. It does not say that the search was meaningless. It says certainty was claimed too soon. It does not say certainty can never come. This separation between knowledge and wish is one of the most restful forms of honesty. Even when the subject is painful, you do not have to force the unknown into a shape tonight. You can let the known facts rest in one place and the unanswered questions rest in another. The file becomes less tangled when you stop asking every page to provide an ending. Some pages only provide limits, and limits are useful. You can imagine writing 2 quiet columns in a notebook. Known, unknown. Under known, you place the date, the place, the friend, the name Johnny, the later discovery, the failed conviction, the innocence finding. Under unknown, you place the identity of the man, the exact path from the corner, and the full truth of what happened after Kathy went home for mittens. The columns do not solve the case, but they calm the mind. That calm matters because cold cases attract speculation. Speculation can begin as care, but it can grow careless if it forgets real people. The Ridulph case has already carried enough error. A gentle retelling should not add more. We stay close to the record. We acknowledge uncertainty. We avoid naming guilt where the law and evidence do not support it. That is not less compelling. It is more humane. The night has a way of making old questions feel larger, but the lamp keeps the circle small. You and I only need the next page, the next detail, the next careful distinction. The Ridulph case has waited for decades, so it can wait while we breathe. Nothing here needs to be solved in a hurry. The file is not asking for speed. It is asking for patience. And patience leads us back once more to the evidence that survived by accident, by duty, and by the quiet habits of record keeping. Record keeping is rarely remembered as an act of care while it is happening. Yet in the Ridulph case, the saved record became one of the strongest voices left. You can imagine a clerk noting a call, an officer filing a report, a military office handling a young man's paperwork, each person moving through an ordinary task without any sense of history gathering nearby. The paper did not know it would matter. It simply survived long enough to be read again. There is something deeply patient about that survival. A page sits in a folder through elections, retirements, office moves, building renovations, and changes in technology. It may be copied, stapled, unstapled, scanned, or misfiled and found again. Its edges yellow while the words remain. In the Ridulph case, those words became part of a later reckoning because a detail that seemed administrative could become the firmest obstacle to a wrongful conclusion. You can feel the texture of such a page if you imagine it under your fingertips. It is not crisp anymore. It may bend too easily at the corner. The ink may be uneven, and the typed letters may carry the slight imperfections of an older machine. Yet the information itself can remain steadier than memory. A time, a place, a phone connection, a piece of travel. A record does not become true because it is old, but age can make its survival remarkable. The collect call detail belongs in this quiet category. It was not made for detectives as evidence in a murder case. It was made because someone placed a call and a system recorded it. That plainness is part of its strength. It did not arise from the later need to prove anything. It existed before the trial, before the conviction, before the review, before anyone in the 21st century argued about its meaning. It waited in the record with a kind of unknowing patience. When a cold case depends on old records, the investigator must become almost like an archivist. You look not only for the dramatic item, but for the context that tells you what the item meant when it was created. Was the time local? Was the notation routine? Who would have entered it? Was it a copy of a copy? Was there any reason it might be wrong? You ask these questions gently, because respect for evidence includes testing it. In the Ridulph case, the later review treated the Rockford record as part of a larger alignment. The call alone mattered, but it mattered most when placed beside the disappearance timeline and the road distance. Evidence becomes stronger when independent pieces agree without seeming to have been shaped for that purpose. A call record, a map, and weather conditions do not conspire emotionally. They simply sit near one another and make certain movements unlikely. You can imagine a reviewer drawing the line from Sycamore to Rockford again and again. Not with excitement, with care. How long would the drive take? What roads would have been used? What was known about the time Maria disappeared? What time was the call? Could someone be in both places? The question is almost plain enough for a kitchen table, and yet it carried the force to help undo a conviction that had seemed historic. This is why humble records deserve attention. They may not satisfy the craving for a dramatic clue, but they can protect the truth more reliably than dramatic clues sometimes do. The Ridulph case shows that the smallest dry fact can become the place where a whole theory fails. You read the file by lamplight, and the lesson settles softly. Keep the paper, read the paper. Do not assume the paper is dull, but even the strongest record needs a careful reader, and the next part of the file belongs to the act of reading itself. Reading a cold case file is not the same as reading a finished story. A finished story knows where it is going. A file does not. It contains false starts, abandoned leads, repeated names, contradictions, and pages that mattered deeply to someone for 1 week and never again. In the Ridulph case, that disorder was multiplied by time. You can imagine the boxes containing not one clean narrative, but many attempts at one, stacked together in uneasy silence. The reader's first task is to slow down enough to notice which facts have become familiar by repetition rather than proof. A statement repeated in many later documents may still come from one fragile source. A rumor typed into a report may gain official appearance without gaining reliability. A suspect's name may appear often because investigators kept returning to him, not because new evidence strengthened the claim. You sit with that carefully because paper can echo. Echo is one of the quiet dangers in old cases. A detail appears in an early note, then in a summary, then in a memorandum, then in a news account, then in public memory. By the time it returns to the file, it may sound confirmed, but if all those versions trace back to the same uncertain origin, the echo has not become evidence. It has only become louder. The Ridulph case required readers willing to ask where each sound began. This is especially important with the name Johnny. The name had force because Kathy reported it from the evening itself. But over decades, that name also became a vessel for theory. Who might have used it? Who might have been called by it? Who might have seemed to fit? You can see how a simple name gathers associations. A careful reader must keep returning to the first known use, the child's account, and not let later suspicion rewrite the word. Reading also means noticing what a file cannot tell you. It may not show tone of voice. It may not show hesitation before an answer. It may not show whether an officer led a witness without meaning to. It may not show the exhaustion in a family member's face after another interview. You can smell the old paper,
and feel its authority. But you must remember that life is larger than what was typed. The Ridulph case lives in that gap. At the same time, the file may preserve what memory cannot. It may capture a time before anyone knew which fact would matter. It may record a name before public discussion shaped it. It may hold a call record that does not care what anyone later believed. This is the balance we keep returning to. Paper is partial, but memory is partial too. The investigator's patience lies in letting each kind of evidence help and limit the other. You can picture yourself marking the margins lightly, not with conclusions, but with questions. Source, date, first appearance, corroboration, contradiction. These words guide a cold case reader like small lamps along a hallway. In the Ridulph case, such questions lead back to the alibi and the timeline. They also lead back to the identification and the family statements, asking each one how much weight it can bear after so many years. The file does not mind being questioned. Evidence that is true can withstand careful reading, and evidence that cannot withstand it should not be carrying a conviction. That is a calm principle, almost plain enough to whisper. Yet it is one of the deepest principles in this case. The Ridulph file was questioned, and the legal outcome changed. Not because the past became easy, but because the reading became more exact. From reading, we move to the way exactness can look almost tender when the subject is old grief. Exactness may seem cold at first. It asks for times, distances, names, and legal standards when the heart wants comfort. But in the Ridulph case, exactness became a form of respect. Maria deserved the truth, not a convenient conclusion. McCullough deserved not to be punished for a crime the evidence could not place him at. Kathy deserved to have her memory treated seriously, but not asked to do impossible work. The family deserved honesty, even when honesty reopened pain. You can feel how exactness steadies the room. It does not erase sorrow. It gives sorrow clean edges. When we say Maria disappeared in Sycamore on the 3rd of December, 1957, we are not reducing her to a date. We are honoring the place where the record begins. When we say Maria disappeared in Sycamore on the 3rd of December, 1957, we are not reducing her to a date. The old paper demands that kind of care. If a date is wrong, a timeline may tilt. If a place is vague, a route may seem easier than it was. If a witness's certainty is overstated, a court may hear more than the evidence can give. In a case this old, small inaccuracies are not harmless. They accumulate. You can imagine dust on a lens, barely visible at first, until the whole picture looks softer than it should. That is why patient narration matters too. A storyteller handling the Ridulph case must not hurry toward the word solved without explaining how the word failed. The case was presented as solved after McCullough's conviction, then legally returned to unsolved status after the conviction collapsed. That is not a side note. It is one of the central facts. You can let that fact breathe in the script, because half-truths are louder than silence in old cases. Exactness also means resisting unnecessary darkness. The worst details do not need to be repeated for the listener to understand the gravity. We can say Maria was found, and that her case became a homicide investigation. We can say her life was taken from her family. We can stay with the investigative work, the waiting, the records, and the human cost. Calm does not mean avoidance. It means choosing the humane distance from which truth can be held. You can imagine the difference in the room when a narrator chooses care. The file remains open, but the air does not sharpen. The listener can rest near the facts without being startled awake by cruelty. The Ridulph case is painful enough in its ordinary words. A child did not come home. A town searched. A family waited. A conviction failed. The unknown remained.
Nothing more violent needs to be placed before the mind tonight. Exactness then becomes part of the sleep rhythm. We move carefully from one known point to another. We do not leap. We do not dramatize. We do not pretend that uncertainty is more exciting than certainty. We let uncertainty be what it is, a space where the truth has not yet arrived. In the Ridulph case, that space is large, but it is not empty. It contains all the work that has been done honestly, and because honest work often happens quietly, we can turn now to the investigators, whose patience shaped both the original search and the later correction. The first investigators in the Ridulph case worked under pressure that is easy to underestimate. A missing child case in a small town brings fear quickly. Every hour matters. Every neighbor wants news. Every parent imagines their own child. You can picture officers moving between the Ridulph home, the corner, and the station, carrying details in notebooks and in their tired faces. The cold would have followed them indoors, clinging to coat cuffs and wet shoes. They did not have modern tools, but they had urgency and local knowledge. They knew how to canvass. They knew how to ask who belonged on a street and who did not. They knew how to coordinate searches, follow reported sightings, and keep a town from losing itself entirely to rumor. Their limitations were real, but so was their effort. You can let both truths sit together without making the past either nobler or smaller than it was. The later investigators had a different burden. They inherited a famous cold case, which can be both opportunity and pressure. A famous case brings attention, resources, and motivation. It also brings expectation. People want movement. People want a name. People want the old story to justify its years of waiting by becoming solved at last. You can imagine how that expectation might fill a room, even when no one says it aloud. Cold case investigators often speak with families who have heard promises before. They must be hopeful without being careless. They must explain what can be done, what cannot be done, and what might take months or years. In the Ridulph case, reopening the file meant stepping into decades of grief and public memory. Every new interview had the potential to awaken hope. Every old detail carried emotional charge. The work required gentleness as well as discipline. When the renewed investigation focused on McCullough, the case gained momentum. Momentum can be useful. It gathers scattered work into direction. It helps a case move toward charges when evidence supports them. But momentum must be watched, because it can begin to carry the reader past inconvenient details. The alibi evidence later identified as crucial was one of those details that needed more weight. Patient work sometimes means slowing momentum before it becomes conclusion. The prosecutor who later reviewed the conviction had to practice a different kind of patience. He was not simply building a case. He was testing one that had already won. That can be harder in its own way. The system has a natural desire to defend its outcomes. Final judgments feel stable. A celebrated conviction may feel especially difficult to question. Yet the Ridulph case required that questioning, because the timeline problem did not disappear after sentencing. You can imagine the review as a long evening of comparison. Trial record beside old report. Phone call beside map. Testimony beside travel time. A pen circling a time, then pausing. A note made in the margin. The coffee in the cup has gone cold. Outside the office, the town goes on with ordinary errands. Inside, a decades-old conviction begins to loosen under the pressure of exact reading. That scene may be less cinematic than an arrest, but it is no less important. Justice often turns in rooms like that, with no audience, no raised voices, and no immediate recognition. Someone checks again. Someone admits the numbers do not work. Someone writes the hard conclusion. In the Ridulph case, the hard conclusion was that McCullough should not remain convicted. The old record, read carefully, required correction. This does not make the first search meaningless, or the later investigation worthless. It makes the entire history more human. People try, people err, people correct. The best systems make room for that correction before the harm grows even larger. You can feel the humility in such a system when it works, even belatedly. The file is not proud. It simply keeps its pages until someone reads them well enough. And after the investigators and reviewers, we come again to the witnesses, whose memories gave the case life and difficulty in equal measure. A witness in an old case stands in a difficult place. They are asked to be a bridge across time, though no human mind was built for perfect bridging. Kathy's memory of the man called Johnny was essential to the Ridulph case from the beginning. It gave investigators a figure to seek. It also became, decades later, one of the most debated pieces of evidence. You can feel how heavy that would be for one person to carry. When a child witnesses part of a case, adults often want the child's memory to be pure because it comes from innocence. But innocence is not the same as precision. A child may be honest and still mistaken about distance, age, height, or time. A child may remember a face with emotional clarity, but not forensic accuracy. You and I can say that gently. It is not criticism. It is compassion for the limits placed on a young witness. As Kathy aged, her memory aged with her. It may have remained vivid. It may have been revisited many times. It may have been strengthened in feeling, while becoming harder to separate from later knowledge. Memory researchers have written at length about such changes. But even without technical language, we know something of it in ordinary life. We remember a childhood room, then see an old photograph and realize the walls were a different color than we had believed. That ordinary experience becomes consequential in court. If you misremember a bedroom wall, little is harmed. If a witness misidentifies a person in a murder case, the consequences can be enormous. This is why the Ridulph case belongs in discussions of patience. Not because Kathy lacked sincerity, but because sincerity and accuracy are not identical. A careful system must honor the witness while also protecting against the known frailty of memory. Other witnesses may have carried smaller fragments. Someone saw a car. Someone heard a report. Someone remembered a young man. Someone recalled family words years later. Each fragment entered the file with its own limitations. You can imagine them as small pieces of glass, some clear, some cloudy, some reflecting too much light. The investigator's job is not merely to collect them, it is to see whether they form a true window or only the appearance of one. The family statements connected to McCullough added an especially sensitive layer. Families know things outsiders do not, but families also have histories, tensions, loyalties, and old wounds. A suspicion inside a family may be meaningful, or it may be shaped by conflict and fear. A statement remembered after a death may carry emotional force, but it cannot easily be cross-examined at its source. The Ridulph case required caution around such material, and the later reversal confirms why. You can sit with the discomfort of that. We want family memories to help. Often they do. A relative saved letter, a late confession, or a long-kept secret can solve a case, but not every family memory is proof. The line between clue and conclusion must remain visible. In this case, the line was crossed too heavily when the conviction was allowed to stand, despite the alibi evidence that later proved so important. Witnesses are not machines, and neither are investigators. They influence one another through questions, tone, repetition, and expectation. A witness may become more certain after being believed. An investigator may become more committed after hearing certainty. A prosecutor may build a narrative around that shared confidence. You can see how human warmth can become legal danger if it is not balanced by independent evidence. The Ridulph case is full of that lesson. Still, the witnesses should not be treated harshly in our telling. They were part of a long effort to answer an old wrong. They gave what they believed they knew. The failure belonged not to one memory alone, but to the larger process that gave certain evidence too much weight and other evidence too little. You can let the blame remain measured. The point is not to shame the past. The point is to learn from it. and learning from it brings us back to the strange, quiet strength of independent corroboration. Independent corroboration is a plain phrase, but in the Ridulph case, it is almost a lantern. It asks whether one piece of evidence is supported by another piece that did not come from the same uncertain source. A memory supported only by repeated memory remains fragile. A timeline supported by records, geography, and weather grows stronger. You can picture the lantern moving across the table, lighting one document after another, showing which pieces truly connect. The Rockford call had value because it stood apart from later suspicion. It was not a person remembering after decades. It was a record made at the time. The travel realities stood apart as well. Roads and distances do not change because a story needs them to. Together, they corroborated the alibi in a way that memory could not easily overcome. That is why the later review gave them such importance, and why the conviction could not survive. Corroboration is not always available in old cases. Sometimes all that remains is testimony. Sometimes the physical evidence is gone. Sometimes the records were never made. When that happens, investigators may still work, but they must be honest about the weakness of the ground. In the Ridulph case, enough records remained to test the conviction, and that was fortunate. The preservation of those records allowed the truth of one narrow question to become clearer. You can think of corroboration as a way of asking the world to answer a human claim. A person says, "I remember." The world says, "Here is a record." A person says, "He could have driven there." The world says, "Measure the road." A person says, "The timing works." The world says, "Place the clock beside the map." The Ridulph file becomes a conversation between memory and the physical world, and the physical world keeps answering softly. This soft answering is part of why the case feels so atmospheric, not because it is embellished, but because the objects are so ordinary. A road in winter, a phone line, a sheet of paper, a photograph in a folder. These things do not perform. They endure. You can smell the faint dust of the file, hear the low hum of the room, feel the coolness of the tabletop, and know that investigation is often more about endurance than brilliance. Corroboration also protects witnesses from bearing too much. Kathy's memory should not have had to carry the case alone after so many years. A witness deserves support from the record before their recollection is used to take away a person's liberty. That is not a lowering of respect. It is a form of respect. It recognizes that no human being should be asked to function as an unchanging recording device across half a century. The same is true for family statements. If a family memory points toward a suspect, investigators can treat it as a lead. They can seek records, dates, locations, independent admissions, or physical evidence. But if corroboration does not come, the memory remains a lead, not an ending. The Ridulph case shows the cost when that distinction is not kept clear enough. The desire for an answer can make a lead feel like a rival. You can rest for a moment with the difference between lead and proof. A lead points, proof holds. A lead opens a door, proof tells you whether the room beyond belongs to the truth. In old cases, many leads are necessary, and most do not become proof. That is not failure. It is the ordinary work of narrowing the unknown. Maria's case had countless efforts of narrowing, but the final proof has not arrived. The next set of pages brings the question of proof into the public world, where headlines often move faster than evidence can bear. When the Ridulph case returned to public attention with McCullough's arrest and conviction, the story had the shape that newsrooms understand. A decades-old mystery. A suspect from the past. A childhood witness. A family's long wait. A conviction after more than 50 years. You can see why the story traveled. It offered a rare kind of narrative satisfaction, and people are drawn to the thought that even the oldest wrongs might be answered. There is nothing wrong with hoping old cases can be solved.
That hope has helped bring attention to many forgotten victims. It has supported cold case units, forensic review, and renewed witness appeals. But hope becomes risky when it accepts a conclusion too quickly, because the conclusion feels meaningful. In the Ridulph case, the public meaning of a solved case may have moved faster than the unresolved weaknesses inside the file. A headline cannot hold all the caution a case deserves. It cannot pause over the collect call, the road distance, the winter weather, the frailty of decades-old identification, and the later legal reversal. It must choose. Often it chooses the cleanest version. Solved. Convicted. Oldest case closed. You can understand the mechanics of that without accepting the result as sufficient. A script like this has more room, and with more room comes more responsibility. After the conviction was undone, the public story became less tidy and perhaps less widely remembered. Exonerations often receive less attention than convictions. Corrections are quieter than accusations. The first headline writes itself more easily than the second. You can feel the unfairness of that, especially for a person who was declared innocent after being tied publicly to a child's death. The record may change, but public memory can lag like an old clock losing time. This lag matters for Maria too. If public memory continues to treat the case as solved, then the truth of her unsolved case is obscured. The real unknown remains hidden behind a mistaken ending. That is why we keep re-anchoring the status gently. The Ridulph case is not solved today. The man once convicted was cleared by the court. The evidence that seemed to close the file instead became evidence of a serious error. You can imagine someone waking briefly during this narration and hearing the name Maria Ridulph, the Rockford call, the vacated conviction, and understanding where they are in the story. That is part of our pace. We return to the central facts, not because the listener cannot follow, but because the case itself was misremembered publicly. Repetition, handled calmly, can correct without startling. It can let the truth settle into place. Public attention also has a way of flattening people into symbols. Maria becomes the child from an old, cold case. McCullough becomes the man convicted, then cleared. Kathy becomes the witness. Schmack becomes the prosecutor who reversed course. But each person lived beyond those labels. A humane account keeps returning to the personhood beneath them. It lets the legal events matter without turning human lives into props for a mystery. The Ridulph case deserves that kind of attention because its complexity is not a flaw in the story. The complexity is the story. It shows how easily a longing for closure can become part of a prosecution, how old evidence can be revived, how old records can correct that revival, and how an unsolved case can remain open even after the world has once been told otherwise. Nothing about that needs to be rushed. And when we stop rushing, the small sensory details of the file come back, grounding us again in the patient work. You can feel the weight of a full case folder with both hands, not heavy like a box of books, but heavy enough to make the wrist adjust. The tab at the top may be bent, the label may have been replaced. Inside, pages rest in uneven stacks, some legal-sized, some copied onto newer paper, some bearing the shadows of earlier staples. The Ridulph case, as an object, would feel like time made portable. The smell of old files is distinct. Dry paper, dust, faint ink, cardboard, and sometimes the metallic trace of old fasteners. In a courthouse or police archive, there may also be floor wax, stale heat, and the quiet chill of rooms not meant for comfort. You can imagine sitting there long enough that your fingers cool, while your eyes adjust to the small differences between originals and copies. This is not glamorous work. It is faithful work. A photograph makes a different demand on the senses. Its surface may be glossy or matte, its edges squared or softened by handling. The image may show a face from 1957 with the stillness of a life held in paper. When photographs enter a case, they carry a double meaning. They are personal and evidentiary. They can comfort and accuse. In the Ridulph case, photographs helped connect people to memory, but they could not overrule the timeline.
Maps carry their own texture. Folded paper maps have ridges that resist lying flat. Modern printed maps smell of toner and warm paper. Digital maps glow without texture at all, but the mind still turns them into roads, turns and distances. You can trace Sycamore to Rockford and feel the space between them. Not an impossible space in ordinary life, but a consequential space in a narrow window. The alibi lived in that distance. Phone records are less vivid at first glance. They may be tables, codes, times, notations, the kind of material the eye wants to skip. Yet the Ridulph case teaches us not to skip them. The least atmospheric page may carry the most important fact. You can imagine the reviewer's finger stopping on the time of the call, then moving to the timeline, then back again. The room does not change, but the case does. Court transcripts create another kind of sensory world. Thin pages, dense lines, question and answer, like footsteps down a long hallway. They can feel monotonous, but within them lives the exact language that shaped a legal outcome. In the Ridulph case, testimony and argument had to be compared against documents that outlasted the trial's first conclusion. The transcript preserves what was said. The record tests whether what was said could stand. All of these objects require patience from the body. The eyes tire. The back stiffens. The hands turn pages. The mind drifts and returns. You can feel why old investigators sometimes speak of living with a case. It is not just thought. It is physical proximity to evidence over long hours. The case becomes the smell of paper, the feel of a chair, the sound of a copier, the taste of coffee gone lukewarm. In this quiet physical world, the Ridulph case stops being a headline and becomes work again. Work is the right word because patience is active here. It is not simply waiting for someone else to solve the case. It is sorting, reading, comparing, calling, checking, preserving, and being willing to revise. You can picture a detective making one more call to confirm a record, then waiting for a return message that may not come for days. Cold case work is full of such pauses. The pauses are not empty. They are part of the method. In Maria's case, the longest pause was the decades between the first investigation and the renewed prosecution. During that time, the case was not always moving visibly, but it remained part of the world. Files were kept, memories remained, public references appeared and faded. The family carried the absence. A town remembered. Then, when the case moved again, all that quiet duration came with it. The past did not restart cleanly. It arrived already worn. From this worn quality affects everything. A fresh case has immediacy. An old case has layers. Every new statement must be placed against old statements. Every old detail must be checked for later contamination. Every legal decision must account for what time has taken away. In the Ridulph case, the layers became so thick that the conviction itself became one more layer to be reviewed, questioned, and finally removed from the truth of the file. Work also means accepting that some leads do not return. A name may be checked and abandoned. A possible sighting may dissolve. A family story may lead nowhere. A document may raise a question it cannot answer. You can imagine the quiet disappointment of that, repeated over years. Not dramatic disappointment, but the small lowering of the shoulders when one more path ends. The Ridulph file must contain many such endings, none of them the ending people needed. Yet every ended lead has value if it is documented well. It prevents the same ground from being walked again blindly. It tells the next investigator what was tried. It gives the case a memory beyond individual people. That is why record keeping returns as a form of care. A lead that fails honestly can still help the truth by narrowing the field. The Ridulph case needed that kind of faithful narrowing, even when it did not produce a final answer. In the later review, Work meant reweighing what had already been weighed. That can be tedious, and it can also be profound. A person reads the same line everyone else read and asks a different question, not because they are clever in a theatrical way, but because they are patient in a necessary way. The collect call was not hidden by darkness. It was hidden, if we can call it that, by insufficient attention to its full consequence. You can feel how much of the case turns on that phrase, full consequence. A fact is not enough. We must understand what follows from it. If a man was in Rockford at a recorded time, what follows for the sycamore theory? If travel time is too long, what follows for the conviction? If the conviction cannot stand, what follows for the case status? Patient investigation is the art of following facts all the way to their sober end. The sober end here was not closure, it was correction, and correction left Maria's case still asking for its unknown answer. That unknown answer continues to shape how we read every earlier detail. The man called Johnny remains the central figure who cannot be securely named. You can picture the description hovering over the file like a pencil sketch with softened lines. Young, approachable enough to speak with children, using a common name, present in a small window of time. The sketch is not nothing, but it is not enough. It has guided years of thought without yielding a verified identity. If he was local, someone may once have known something and never connected it fully. If he was passing through, the trail may have been thin from the start. If he used a false name, that false name did its work well. These possibilities can be considered, but not turned into claims. The Ridulph case has had enough of overclaiming. We let possibilities remain possibilities, like cards laid face down because the evidence has not turned them over. The location near Woodbine, where Maria was later found, added another geographical point to the case. It suggested movement beyond Sycamore, and investigators had to think about roads leading west, rural spaces, and who might have known or chosen that area. You can imagine a map expanding from the neighborhood corner to the wider region, lines spreading through northern Illinois. The case became not only who was near Maria, but who could move through those places unnoticed. Rural roads have their own quiet. Fields, tree lines, gravel shoulders, the sound of wind unobstructed by buildings. In the late 1950s, such areas could feel farther from town than they do now, not only by distance but by visibility. A car traveling after dark might pass through long stretches with few witnesses. Investigators would have had to ask who knew those roads, who had reason to be there, and who might have gone unseen. Still, geography alone could not identify Johnny. It could only shape the possibilities. This is a recurring pattern in the Ridulph case. One piece points, another limits, another complicates. The file never allows a single clue to carry the whole burden for long. That may be frustrating, but it is also why the case remains instructive. It resists the simple habits of storytelling and asks for a slower, more honest structure. You can imagine the original searchers dealing with winter darkness across both town and countryside. Flashlights catching on snow, tires crunching, radios crackling softly, gloves stiff around steering wheels. Each sensory detail reminds us that investigation happens in bodies, in weather, in fatigue. It is not just a sequence of facts. It is people moving through cold air because a child is missing, then continuing after the worst news because the truth still matters. The later investigators moved through a different landscape of evidence, more paper than field, more memory than fresh trace. Yet the feeling of searching remained. Instead of scanning roadsides, they scanned transcripts. Instead of knocking on every nearby door, they returned to old interviews. Instead of following footprints, they followed records. The tools changed, but the essential posture remained the same. Someone was missing from the known world of answers, and the file kept asking. That posture is what we keep beside us tonight, as the script moves onward without rushing toward an ending. The Ridulph case is not asking for a dramatic final image yet. It is asking us to stay with the method, the people, the paper, and the caution. We are still at the desk. The lamp is still on. The pages still have more to teach. And the next lesson may be the quietest one: how a case can be both famous and misunderstood. Fame does not clarify a case by itself. Sometimes it spreads confusion farther. The Ridulph case became famous first because of Maria's disappearance, then because of its age, then because of the conviction, and later because of the reversal. Each wave of attention carried different facts to different audiences. You can imagine someone knowing only the first wave, another knowing only the conviction, another hearing only the exoneration. The full story requires gathering all of them back into one room. Misunderstanding often begins with a true fact that is left alone too long. It is true that McCullough was convicted. If that fact is told without the later reversal, it misleads. It is true that Kathy identified him. If that fact is told without the later reversal, it misleads. It is true that the case was considered solved for a time. If that fact is told without the current unsolved status, it misleads. Truth needs context, the way a road needs direction signs. You can see why a gentle script must keep recontextualizing, not repeating mechanically, but returning like a hand smoothing a page. The Ridulph case moved through belief and correction. The weird evidence did not produce the simple solved ending suggested by early coverage after the conviction. Instead, the weird evidence ultimately showed how fragile that ending was. This is not a contradiction to hide. It is the heart of the case's modern meaning. Famous cases also gather amateur certainty. People read a few details and feel the pull of an answer. They may choose a suspect, defend a theory, or dismiss a legal reversal because it complicates the story they prefer. You can be gentle about that impulse because it comes from the same human desire for order. But the Ridulph case asks us to do better than impulse. It asks us to let the corrected record correct us. That correction is an act of respect for Maria. An unsolved case honestly held keeps the search open in principle. A false certainty closes the door too soon. If the real answer ever emerges, it will need space to be recognized. That space can be crowded by old mistakes if we keep repeating them. So tonight, we leave space. We say what is known. We set down what failed. We keep the unknown open, but not empty. The public record now contains the conviction and the exoneration, and both belong to the history of the Ridulph case. Removing the conviction from the truth of guilt does not remove it from the story of the investigation. It remains a chapter in how the case was handled and how the system later corrected itself. You can imagine that chapter as a folder within the larger box, labeled not solution, but caution. Caution is not a cold word here. It is warm with responsibility. It tells us to be careful before accusing, careful before closing, careful before repeating, careful before forgetting. It tells us to protect the dead from being used to justify error, and to protect the living from being swallowed by an old grief's need for shape. The Ridulph case gives caution a human face, because every mistake in it touched someone real. As you read, you may notice how often the case returns to pairs. Memory and record, Sycamore and Rockford, conviction and reversal, hope and caution, Maria and the unknown Johnny. These pairs do not resolve neatly. They sit across from each other in the quiet room, asking to be held together. The work tonight is simply to hold them without forcing one to erase the other. And once we hold them that way, the file becomes less like a puzzle box and more like a weathered ledger of human patience. A ledger records what has been entered, not what we wish had happened. The Ridulph case ledger contains the first winter evening, the search, the discovery near Woodbine, the long unsolved years, the renewed suspicion of McCullough, the trial, the conviction, the alibi review, the vacating of the conviction, the dismissal of charges, and the innocence finding. It also contains empty lines where the final answer should be. Those empty lines are part of the record too. You can imagine running your eyes down such a ledger, each entry written in calm ink. No exclamation points, no dramatic emphasis. Just the slow accounting of a case that has outlived many of the people who first worked it. The emptiness near the bottom does not mean the ledger has failed. It means the truth has not filled that space yet. A good record leaves empty space empty, rather than writing the wrong thing there. This is one reason the Ridulph case feels almost archival in its sorrow. It is not only about a single night. It is about the long stewardship of a question. The question moved from family to police, from police to courts, from courts to reviewers, from reviewers back into public memory. Each steward had a chance to handle it carefully. Some handling helped, some harmed. The question itself remained, altered by every hand but not answered. The evidence that survived by routine gives the case a quiet moral. Small acts of preservation can matter beyond imagination. The clerk who kept the phone record could not have known. The officer who saved an alibi note could not have known. The person who stored a transcript could not have known. Yet the later legal truth depended on such survival. You can feel a kind of gratitude for the ordinary systems that did not lose everything. At the same time, the case warns that preserved evidence must be understood. A record in a box is not justice by itself. It needs a reader who sees its relevance, a system willing to listen, and a court willing to correct. The Ridulph case had records that could have prevented or complicated the conviction earlier, yet their full force emerged later. Preservation is the first kindness. Attention is the second. Attention, in this context, is almost a discipline of love. Not sentimental love, but the kind that refuses to use people carelessly. It looks at Maria's photograph and says her case matters too much for a false ending. It looks at McCullough's alibi and says a conviction cannot stand if the timing fails. It looks at Kathy's memory and says this witness deserves compassion and limits. It looks at the family and says grief deserves truth, not performance. You can sit with that discipline as the room grows quieter. The file is still open, but your breathing can slow around it. Nothing in the case becomes less serious because the voice remains calm. Seriousness does not require tension. In fact, the calm may help us see more clearly. The Ridulph case has had enough noise from headlines and certainty. It benefits from the low light of careful attention. And careful attention naturally returns to the timeline, because time is the thread that kept pulling the supposed solution apart. The timeline is a narrow river running through the Ridulph case. On one bank is Sycamore, with Maria and Kathy near the corner. On the other is Rockford, with Tessier's recorded presence and the collect call. Between them are roads, minutes, weather, and the physical limits of movement. You can imagine placing small stones along the river to mark known times, then seeing whether anyone can cross where the prosecution's story requires. The later review found that crossing could not be made. The call from Rockford placed Tessier away from Sycamore too close to the critical window. The drive would have taken too long, especially under the conditions understood from the record. That conclusion is not emotionally elaborate, but it is powerful. The prosecution's theory needed time that the record did not give. In old cases, missing minutes can be as decisive as missing fingerprints. You can feel the simplicity of it and the sadness. So much grief, so much waiting, so much public attention, and then a set of minutes refuses the answer that had been offered. There is no drama in the refusal. The clock does not raise its voice. The map does not argue. They simply remain what they are. The distance between towns remains. The time of the call remains. The narrowness of the window remains. That is why the Ridulph case belongs among stories of patient detective work, even though its most important modern lesson is an exoneration rather than a final identification. Patient work solved a question inside the case, whether McCullough's conviction was reliable. It was not. That solution did not solve Maria's case, but it mattered deeply. Sometimes justice advances by removing a wrong answer before it can be mistaken for truth forever. The phrase wrong answer has a special weight here. In a schoolroom, a wrong answer can be erased. In a murder case, it can imprison someone and mislead a community. It can make a family believe one thing while the real unknown remains beyond reach. It can reshape public memory for years. The Ridulph case shows how important it is to catch a wrong answer, even late, even after people have built emotional shelter around it. You can imagine the emotional difficulty of telling a family that the shelter cannot stand. The answer they may have been given, the answer some may have accepted, has to be taken down. Not because anyone wants more pain, but because truth cannot be built with a beam that has cracked. This image is quiet, but it helps. A structure may look whole until someone checks the load-bearing piece. The timeline was that piece. Once the timeline failed, the conviction could not remain as the case is ending. The record had to change, and it did. The charges were dismissed. McCullough was declared innocent. The Ridulph case returned to the unsolved category where it had spent most of its life. You can hear the soft finality of the legal correction, even as the larger mystery remains open. One door closed. Another, older door remained closed for lack of a key. The key, if it still exists, would have to come from evidence not yet understood or not yet found. It might be a document, a confession, a corroborated family story, a forensic result, or some other material no one can responsibly predict. We do not invent it tonight. We only make space for it by refusing the wrong key. That is enough for this part of the file. And from the timeline's quiet refusal, we move again into the larger meaning of patience, where the case continues to teach without resolving. Patience, in the Ridulph case, does not give us the comfort of a final name. It gives us something quieter, and in its own way, necessary. Maria Ridulph's case remains unsolved. Jack McCullough, once convicted in the case, had that conviction vacated, the charges dismissed, and he was later declared innocent by the court. No one is serving as the legally responsible person for Maria's death, and the answer to who called himself Johnny has not been found. That is the real shape of the file as it rests tonight. Not empty and not finished, it holds Maria's name, Kathy's winter memory, Sycamore's long waiting, the Rockford call, the corrected conviction, and the careful warning that old evidence must be read with humility. It holds the hope people carried, and the mistake that hope could not repair. It holds the quiet truth that an unsolved case is better left open than closed around the wrong person. You can leave the papers where they are now. The lamp is low, and the room has gone soft at the edges. The old photographs do not need anything more from you tonight. The map can fold back into itself. The phone record can return to its place among the other pages, still plain, still patient, still doing the small work it was able to do. Some mysteries do not end with an answer. They end, for a while, with care. They ask to be remembered accurately, not loudly, and to be held without forcing certainty, where certainty never came. Maria's name remains in the quiet, and the unanswered part of the Ridulph case remains beside it, open, waiting, and still. For now, the file can close gently, the questions can settle into the dark, and you can let the old winter street grow quiet.